Fascism. What does it mean? What was fascism historically? Can fascism happen again today? Is the term being overused by woke left activists? Are far-right political movements examples of fascism? And does content that we encounter online, pushing culture war issues, hot takes, edginess, and extreme political points of view, constitute an endorsement of fascist politics, or is it something else? My hope is that after watching this video, you'll have answers to all of these questions, and also you'll be better equipped to understand fascism, and importantly to understand our contemporary political landscape, and in particular I hope that that will help you engage with politics, and also provide pushback on harmful and extremist political viewpoints or political movements that might be taking place. This video is split into discrete sections with timestamps and chapters in the description, so if there's anything specific that you're interested in, simply go to the description and click on those. I highly recommend doing this if there's some particular aspect of fascism that you're interested in, however the video will also work if you just view it sequentially. Now, all of this takes place in a context.
Everything is in context. You exist in the coconut, but you live in the cave.
And there's this section on context, political context, that was just way too long. So I'm going to refer people to this video from the other video when it's published.
Everything is in context.
That context is that we see far-right and extremist political movements in the US, the UK, Europe, and globally. Within that, as someone who engages with philosophy and religion and politics as a result of that in online spaces, I've ended up talking to some people who hold very extreme views that I strongly disagree with. One of those people is Andrew Wilson, who I have accused of being a fascist. And my conversation with Andrew is partly my reason for creating a video like this. This video, however, is not just a petty dispute between myself and Andrew. I genuinely want this to be a wider resource on fascism and in particular contemporary fascist movements and how people should think about them. There is a section in this video that goes in more depth into Andrew Wilson's particular claims, and that is after having cleared up what fascism is, as that's a necessary prerequisite in order to be able to establish whether or not he meets those criteria. However, I'm going to just put a little tidbit out there at the start of this because I suspect that people who are more sympathetic towards Andrew or critical of my claims or my actions are not going to want to give me the charity of sticking around to see all that stuff.
Certified democracy hater. Like, so I don't know if you didn't know that, right? I'm a certified democracy hater.
I hate to be clear. We don't live in a monarchy in the United States of America. It's a democracy.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible.
It's a more.
I know. It's terrible.
It's a more.
Well, how does that make us a stronger nation, dude?
This shit is ours because I have the gun, and we're going to take this shit by force.
Sure.
But he did not want industrialists and rich bankers who were controlling industrialists to come in and take over his fucking nation that we had conquered from the savages. The majority of power needs to rely with one person. I think that the rest of the tangentials around that were just like Rand, something of a coping mechanism because the guy was really saying there's going to be a natural hierarchy. There's going to be a motherfucker at the top of that hierarchy, and you want that shit.
The United States was basically all European.
Right.
I mean, basically all of it was European. There was...
well, blacks can run fast.
Libertarianism is, in the end, a system which inevitably leads to degeneracy. The reason libertarians currently have a Skittles nominee for president is because the very ideology itself is corrupt. If they own themselves and they're adults, that is exactly what you would make the argument for gay marriage. They're adults. Can you actually justify why that's wrong? Enforcement against this kind of thing, and how could you have enforcement against it without a government?
What against what kind of thing?
Like incest or gay marriage or any of these degenerate actions.
Why? Stephen Wolfe is?
Yeah.
He wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first off, I don't know.
I have the book.
What do you think of Stephen Wolfe and the book and his ideas?
I think he makes some good points. I think he makes a good point through the idea of coercive structure, Christianity is the
properly ordered.
Yeah, there's the only thing which can ultimately exist for the stability of a society long term. I think he's right. Can you tell me why it is that I would be wrong then, seizing power under whatever authority I wanted?
I'm not saying you'd be wrong.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
saying,
well, then, here's the thing.
I find
regardless
it interesting.
of whatever the philosophical foundation, whatever the philosophical foundation is,
so interesting,
in which I adhere to, I guess doesn't really matter if there's no objection to Christian seizing power, right?
I have seen
is that's just how the system
Let's
works.
see what happens.
It's totally viable. It's totally viable and reasonable as long as Christian nationalism gets a foothold in. Repeal the 19th, like they did maybe for abortion, right?
Right.
So,
I actually was surprised that happened. I didn't think that never happened.
everybody was surprised it happened, but like I said, it can happen very rapidly. It's like, let's not pretend that this is not viable, right? It's just that we get to pervert the system back, right? We get to do it back to them, the same thing they did to us.
You know, I would say law enforcement, we do the same thing, right? One who enforces the laws of the nation does X, Y, Z. For some reason, the Christians can't have that. That's weird.
Okay,
Mostly from women.
And do you think that calling men victims then empowers them to justify their own failings that they actually could control?
No. There's a distinction here. Men are actual victims because of the single motherhood epidemic. We can point to the actual thing that they were the victims of, which is women. They were the victims of women who decided that they were going to be fucking empowered by embracing single motherhood, not because of anything other than I had irreconcilable differences with my actually pretty good husband, who I just decided to get rid of because I wanted to fuck Chad down the street.
Okay, what if...
Agree. Does every single time you have sex with a woman require consent? And I enjoy it. I enjoy raping her. I enjoy it.
Having sex with someone unconscious?
My wife, yeah. Yeah, I like it waking her up that way.
But you said if she didn't wake up, you would stop.
I know she does sometimes. She's like,
I don't.
She's like, And I'm like, yeah, that's right. And she's like, okay. I know, yeah. She's like she can't believe this is happening. I've really shocked her. And then she just she's okay with it. Is that wild? Am I graping her?
I think without having some form of express consent, then yeah.
Yeah. Damn, I do this all the time. Constantly. I really do. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Constantly is crazy.
Yeah. Anytime I wake up with a boner, if she's not awake, she's definitely getting woke up that way. Certified democracy hater. I don't know if you didn't know that, right? I'm a certified democracy hater.
So there we have it. Everyone can clearly see that Andrew's a fascist, and there is no need for me to produce a long, detailed video going through academic sources discussing what fascism is, and then interrogating Andrew's views in order to do that. And that's because everyone involved in these discussions is a reasonable adult who is concerned with truth and cares about thinking about things carefully and cautiously and believing what's true. Right? 1.0.0 Fascism, Definitions and Debates. First, let me make something clear. There is no the definition of fascism. There is no single independent source of truth or arbitrating authority who gets to decide what fascism is or means. Fascism is a term with its roots in an historic Italian political movement. That movement has been reflected on and related to various subsequent political movements and attitudes. The word is used in an historic way, and the word has many other legitimate and important uses too. My aim in this video is to give a broad survey of all of these things, and to provide an adequate characterization of fascism, by which I mean one that will enable you to both understand history, but also to engage with and understand contemporary politics. And I'm also not interested in lawyering you into a view, where you will come to see political movements like MAGA or Trump as fascists. I have my own views about these things, but my aim is to give an accurate historic overview, and also to engage in political philosophy in a careful, fair and scholarly way, and with putting all that information on the table, my genuine aim is to educate you into a position where you are able to evaluate political situations you find yourself in, and see what you think for yourself about whether or not political parties and movements are fascist. So let's start with a high-level background. In Oxford University Press's A Very Short Introduction to Fascism by Kevin Passmore, he tries to essentially do something like what I'm trying to do in this video, but in book form. Chapter 2 of his book is called A and Not A, What is Fascism? He begins by talking about the historical context of fascism, and the movements that arise out of the context of World War I in Italy and in Germany. He then talks about the reception of these views after the war. For example, on page 11 he says, quote, "After 1945, fascism's legacy continued to structure the political landscape. Political leaders in the Allied countries drew legitimacy from their role in defeating fascism, while governments in Italy and Germany claimed dissent from the anti-fascist resistance. The left accused conservative anti-communists of being fascists, while the right equated communism with fascism. Given that fascism has become an all-purpose term of abuse, it is no surprise that those who mimic fascism have not hitherto become politically relevant. But movements that owe something to fascism, especially its nationalism and racism, made something of a breakthrough during the late 1990s. Along with liberalism, conservatism, communism, socialism and democracy, fascism is one of the great political ideologies that shaped the 20th century. In the 21st century, interest in the history of fascism and its crimes is perhaps greater than ever. Yet how can we make sense of an ideology that appeals to skinheads and intellectuals, denounces the bourgeoisie while forming alliances with conservatives, adopts a macho style yet attracts many women, calls for a return to tradition and is fascinated by technology, idealizes the people and is contemptuous of mass society, and preaches violence in the name of order? Fascism, as Ortega y Gasset says, is always A and not A. Passmore also says with respect to definitions, those who study the literature on fascism in the hope of pinning down a precise meaning often throw up their hands in despair. It all depends on definition, they sigh wearily, so it must be a matter of personal opinion. Yes, everything does depend on definition, but this should not be a reason for abandoning the concept. At the risk of straining the patience of the reader, I want to explain what we require from definitions. How do we define definitions? And note, if you're watching my video, that the next section on gumming up the works goes into some more detail on this. One of the desiderata of a definition, Passmore claims, is that it should frame a concept in a way that it can be subjected to criticism and possible contradiction. That is to say, a characterization of a concept that is given, that says nothing at all, will not be able to be criticized, because we won't be able to interrogate the ways in which it works or makes claims about the ways the world is. Another desiderata, claims Passmore, is that characterizations as definitions should illuminate and make sense of things that we want to know about. For example, maybe I didn't know about fascism at all, or maybe I had some low-resolution idea of fascism. In reading or hearing some characterization of fascism, do I learn about the concept? Do I gain a knowledge I didn't previously have? Or do I get something more vague, something that says nothing at all? It is whatever it is. Even though a desiderata for a good definition is going to be that it's informative, there might be an unrealistic requirement of maximal informativeness. Passmore says about these demands for exhaustive definitions that the diversity of human life is such that no concept can account for every feature of any object of study, and the study of fascism doesn't depart from this rule. But some concepts explain more than others, so we must ask how much of our object of study and which aspects of it are explained by a particular concept. Now, the problem here is going to be with a complicated phenomena such as fascism, that the more a definition seeks to include, the more counterexamples and edge cases it's going to be susceptible to. And the more specific that a definition is, the more restrictive it is. That is to say, we could end up with characterizations of fascism that only apply to very specific parts of Italian politics in a very specific time period, but in fact wouldn't even apply to, say, Hitler's Germany or Franco's Spain. Where exactly we want to draw these lines come down to a few things. One of those things is going to be, what are we aiming to do in our inquiry? Why are we trying to characterize fascism? So if we're involved in an academic discipline that's looking at a very specific period of history, then we will of course have a preference for more specific and refined characterizations of fascism, so we don't have to concern ourselves with a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, if we're concerned with engagement in contemporary politics, as I am in this video, absolutely we're going to want to engage with history. Absolutely, we want to engage with academia. But the aims of our inquiry are not to be so restrictive to enable us to clearly talk about one very specific period of history, but to enable us to find general wrong-making features of harmful historic political movements, to understand how those features have been received by other harmful political movements, and within that overall characterization, to see if there are troubling red flags that we should be looking out for in political movements today, in the sense that those movements are relevantly similar, such that we should be invoking the harsh and severe historic memory of the democratic world's response to historic fascism. 1.1.0 Historic Fascisms. Fascism has its origins in some quite specific historical movements coming out of Italy in the early 20th century. Whilst I'm going to be arguing that many of the features of historic Italian fascism are not essential for understanding fascism as a political ideology, it is important to have a firm grasp of this historic movement. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because there is broad consensus agreement, even where there's disagreement in a contemporary context, around what constitutes historic fascism. And secondly, because it is only by understanding historic fascism that we can come to find out what features of it are at the core of the political ideology, and which features of it are maybe more historically contingent or irrelevant details that we shouldn't expect to be replicated in other contexts. So in trying to communicate historic fascism in an accurate but detailed and clear way, I've had a hard time trying to understand what level to pitch it at, what to include and what to exclude. Luckily, the Rest is History podcast have made that easy for me. The Rest is History is a podcast hosted by Tom Holland of the Tom Holland Argument and Apologetics fame and Dominic Sandbrook. In this episode, they interview Lucy Hughes Hallett, a historian who specialises in this time period, and they explore the history pertaining to Gabriele D'Annunzio, the first fascist.
Steeped in sensuality and sadism and cold-blooded dilettantism. That was the famed Italian historian and philosopher Benedetto Croce talking about the equally celebrated Italian writer Gabriele D'Annunzio, one of the greatest figures in modern Italian literature. He engaged in incendiary speeches in the very heart of ancient Rome, in the Capitol, persuading Italy to enter the Great War. In 1918, he led a dramatic air raid over Vienna. And in 1919, he set up effectively a city-state in the Croatian port of Fiume that was admired by both Lenin and Mussolini. And Mussolini, in fact, would go on to describe D'Annunzio as the John the Baptist of fascism.
But in his emphasis on the great man and his love of modernity, of speed, his worship, his exaltation of blood and sacrifice and violence, his belief in conquest, his belief that his native country has been mutilated, his hatred of parliamentary democracy, all of these things, and not least the black uniforms, I think he looks very much like the first fascist.
Prize-winning biography of him by Lucy Hughes Hallett, The Pike, Gabriele D'Annunzio, poet, seducer and preacher of war, which I think, Lucy, you're with us?
Well, I repeat my subtitle. He was a poet, a seducer, and a preacher of war. That Mussolini was not keen, actually, to acknowledge his debt to D'Annunzio. D'Annunzio wrote to Mussolini in the mid-20s saying, "Isn't it true that all that is best about fascism you have taken from me?" I mean, you might argue that there isn't much that's best about fascism, but it's certainly true that not just the...
Now pay attention to the characteristics that she's going to raise here of early proto-fascism. These will, of course, be relevant to our analysis of contemporary fascism.
Substance, the militarism, the extreme nationalism, the elitism, the anti-democratic view.
So here she highlights themes of this historic proto-fascism, in particular a militaristic, violent tendency and an incredibly hierarchical view of the world. She goes on to talk about, though, how fascism isn't really a particularly principle-driven thing, but really more of an aesthetic.
But also the kind of the manner of fascism came from D'Annunzio. As I say, the manipulation of the press, the theatricality of it, the sense that politics is a performance art. All of that is something that D'Annunzio was onto back in the 1890s when Mussolini was scarcely thinking about politics. And if he was a socialist.
So now Dominic Sandbrook raises this sort of economic and political context which gives rise to some of these fascist ideas. And again, I'm not saying any of these things are necessary or sufficient conditions, but note the sort of economic and political crises which seem to give rise to fascist-type politics.
They have something like 35 administrations in 40 years, don't they? It's a real kind of parliamentary shambles, the Italian state after it's been unified. He is calling it, foul. He's saying parliamentary democracy is vulgar, it's depraved, it's in the parliament is a sewer. All of these themes that we're very familiar with from the 1920s and 1930s that are kind of proto-fascistic. And do you think that, in that respect, is he reflecting a wider, a general Italian context? Or is that something in him? Because he also obviously has this kind of very romantic or post-romantic worship of the great man, which runs counter to kind of parliamentary democracy and the kind of pluralism of the modern democratic age.
Absolutely, yes. And he was an elitist, not just in the rather vague way the word is often used nowadays, but because he really believed there were some people who were better than others.
On this point of elitism too, I want people to pay attention, because in contemporary discourses, people will often refer to the elites in an incredibly ambiguous way. The point in terms of D'Annunzio's thinking is that his elitism is natural or metaphysical, nature, the world or reality, and forces or confers on us these hierarchies within which some people truly are better than others. Now, in our politics, we will find people who complain about the elites, but in terms of characterising harmful political views or proto-fascisms, what we want to be on the lookout for is not the mere complaint against the elites, but actually philosophical views that embed these type of hierarchical claims, where certain people belong on the top and certain people belong on the bottom.
Yeah. And they would see white males in power, and they would go, well, that's clearly a racism.
Sure.
If all these white males are successful, then they must be getting a red carpet. Maybe they are better at politics, white males. Maybe they're better in story. The movies always bomb because they go, well, you have to see it to be it, and we need more females in action movies. But when you look at history, white males are disproportionately part of the story. Think of like Braveheart and William the Conqueror and Jesus Christ and, St. Andrew and all of these different, they just seem to be at the forefront of most stories in history. So maybe it's natural that you have Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and it looks reasonable because that's what's been happening in history.
Also, the actors, things like this, where are you pulling them from? I mean, the United States was basically all European.
Right.
I mean, basically all of it was European.
Why do white men do better in America? Well, it's not because of socio-economic explanations. Why do we not just see whether that is, in fact, where they belong in the natural hierarchy of things?
And those were the people who should be ruling. And they wouldn't necessarily be aristocrats. He had very hard words to say about the spineless offspring of exhausted aristocracies. I mean, he read Darwin, or absorbed Darwin's ideas in the way that he did, and he drew the same sort of conclusions from Darwin that Nietzsche was to do, but separately, before he came across Nietzsche.
I think it's also worth pointing out that these sorts of pseudo-scientific attempts to essentialize natural hierarchies with proto-eugenics or eugenics claims today and just so evolutionary stories are, whilst not necessary or sufficient for something to be fascism, really common features that we can see today.
Isn't the whole hypothesis about race and IQ that people in Africa had it easier so they didn't have to survive, whereas whites had to survive the Siberian winters, and they got better at systems because they had to pickle things and plan for the winter and insulate a home and have firewood for the winter months, but no one else really had to plan that far ahead.
So that's, if we're looking from kind of a purely evolutionary lens, which is what you're kind of looking at. Not really. That wouldn't really be the hypothesis, because they also weren't getting run down by lions and tigers, and they also weren't, having nearly as much trouble.
Well, blacks can run fast.
But so can the whites, right? But yes, Africa had all sorts of conditions that they were dealing with there that were every bit as bad as the conditions dealt with by these northern tribes, right? Same thing. They had all sorts of bad conditions, but they didn't have nearly as much in the way of naturalized resources which were useful. They had those things that nobody cared about then, right? If you're tribal, like gold and diamonds and rubies, right? Nobody gave a fuck about those things.
Those are rocks.
Yeah, those are dumb glittery rocks. We can't eat that. You know what I mean?
Why do you? Because I don't think it's arguable that whites are, especially males, are exceptionally good at systems. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because of Christianity.
So to be fair to Andrew here, right, at least he's providing pushback on Gavin's view. But what's interesting to me is that within these circles, you have these pseudo-scientific attempts at always essentializing natural hierarchies by making appeal to incredibly poorly done evolutionary just so stories. And whilst Gavin might believe what he believes in terms of these naturalistic types of explanations, Andrew justifies his views of natural hierarchies with metaphysics that makes appeal to theological entities. And so whilst they disagree on the details, they're both in firm agreement with someone like D'Annunzio in terms of having explanations that justify a prejudice they probably held in the first place, which is that the in-group deserves to be on top, and that nature justifies it being so.
If you think about evolution, it doesn't happen uniformly, he thought. In every generation, there will be some people who are have evolved further than others.
And he saw himself in that light.
Oh, you bet. Yes.
Right. So the Superman.
He was the Superman. He definitely was. And the Superman should rule.
But he's not a populist if he's an elitist.
He's an elitist populist. It's so confusing.
He didn't like the people much, but he did want them to buy his books. He believed in this elite which was not socially determined. It was a grouping of the great, and quite how you knew whether you were part of this group is a little unclear. D'Annunzio was absolutely clear that he was one of the saved.
About 1919, 1920, when Italy is in such an economic mess at the end of the First World War. It's torn apart by the fighting between the kind of squadristi and Bolsheviks and stuff. And lots of people, there's lots of talk of D'Annunzio becoming a dictator. Do you think that was a possibility? And if he had done so, do you think it would have gone in a kind of Mussolini-like direction? Or was he too much of a dilettante for that to happen?
I think it could easily have happened. And there were certainly people who wanted it to happen, who were, inviting him to step forth. He wasn't at all interested in government. He didn't want to have to think about taxes and...
Boring.
Yeah.
So now we come on to the history of Italian fascism more broadly. That is to say, what happens after D'Annunzio? Philosopher Daniel Bonovac has a great YouTube channel where he has uploaded his lectures talking about many philosophical topics. He has uploaded a lecture on fascism that he gave at the University of Texas, Austin in fall 2013.
Let's introduce ourselves to the guy who really put fascism on the map, Benito Mussolini. He was born in 1883, died in 1945, not coincidentally. He started out as a socialist journalist. He was the editor of a magazine called The Future of the Worker. He became a leader of the Italian Socialist Party. His parents were socialists, and he followed in their footsteps. He saw himself as continuing the cause of the revolution. He took over the government of Italy just shortly after the First World War in 1922, after the March on Rome. You might remember that Italy entered the war on the side of the Allies and fought a series of battles against Austria-Hungary. Italy was actually heavily involved in the First World War and suffered tremendously from it. That meant the government was weak. People really didn't have much allegiance to it. They saw it as having led them into disaster in the First World War. Through electoral means, Mussolini wasn't really able to accomplish much. So he led a march on Rome, basically to show the power of his new fascist movement that demanded a new kind of leader. Here he is, once he arrived in Rome, the march on Rome. And that's the kind of stance you often see him in. He was a small man. Nevertheless, he wants you to know he's tough. So if he were standing here, he wouldn't be standing as I am right now. He'd be standing like this. That was the kind of guy he was, and you see there some of his top leaders who are, yeah, I don't know how to describe those expressions, actually. He did win an election 2 years later, so he sought power by legitimate means. The March on Rome was really to show his power, and he became informally the leader of Italy at that point. But he did get elected to office in 1924.
So one point I want to raise here is that sometimes it is raised that because someone is operating within how they interpret the Constitution or something like that, they couldn't possibly be a fascist. The problem is with that is that when we learn about history, we find that the main fascist movements, Mussolini's movement and Hitler's movement in Nazi Germany, broadly got into power through legitimate means. Now, of course, there are all sorts of going on where they pushed the boundaries of that power and manipulated things to seize control of institutions, courts, and to influence the population. But in all these cases, there's no smoking gun by which you can say it was a coup. There might be peculiar electoral circumstances, riots or the burning down in some democratically sacred place or procedure, things that are not normal. But was there anything in the democratic process where something kicked in to say, these people are manipulating the system, these people have gone too far or they've done something illegal? No.
Does Gavin Newsom legally has the power to push back on that, right?
Yeah, he tried, but he didn't have any authority. He has no authority to do it.
In process, right? So...
Well, no, it's not in process. The protests are done. They fizzled. And you know why they fizzled? They fizzled out. I watched them die on Saturday night. And you know why they died? Because there was fucking military everywhere, and they were bussing these fuckers out by the drove.
Andrew, did Hitler seize power legally or illegally?
Which time?
When he activated Article 41.
I think that was a legal action.
Right. So is the law a good guide to how you can prevent an authoritarian Nazi regime from taking over?
Wait a second. But you would say that if Trump ignored the law, that would be more fascist, right?
No, it depends on the context.
Okay, so it depends on the context. So
No.
the thing is, then here
Not
you
using
can't
powers to-
listen. You can't have
Not
your
using
cake and
powers- no, you're making actually.
bro. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't be like Trump follows the law, but if he didn't follow the law, that would be worser.
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I'm not doing that, fortunately.
Uh-huh.
You know, not using a power that the law grants you is not ignoring the law. That can actually be enforcing the law, right? Just because the law gives you the power to do something doesn't mean that you have.
Where's
to
the riots now, bro? Where are they? Do you see any?
I think that there are protests all across the country. Right?
No, there's not. They fizzled out Saturday. They're done. They're not even in the media spotlight anymore. It's all done because he sent in the troops and he quelled that shit, dude.
Well, that's not what happened because after
It
he
is
sent
what
the-
happened.
After he
As president, he discouraged dissent through violence and intimidation. Those guys whose expressions I found it hard to read, they would go through the streets and make sure you were pro-Mussolini or else. And he rejects Marx's material. He says fascism is the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle, and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. He's going to admit that some of those economic factors are important, that there are social classes, that sometimes they struggle, but he says that's not the full story of everything. That's not the whole history of the world. There's a lot of other stuff going on too. So he says that the vicissitudes of economic life, raw materials, new technical processes, scientific inventions have their importance, no one denies. But that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism. That is to say, in acts which don't have any economic motive. And how do we solve the class struggle? Cross out the bourgeoisie. Here is the fascist picture, according to Mussolini. We unite bourgeoisie and proletariat together in something larger, something that can encompass both, something that can inspire both, and lead both to do something besides promote their own self-interest. And that thing is the state. So we unite them in the state, in the nation. So fascism is something he sees as essentially nationalistic. Here's how we can get bourgeoisie and proletarians to work together. Get them to work together for a greater Italy. Or, in Hitler's case, a greater Germany. Or a greater United States.
There's going to be a natural hierarchy. There's going to be a motherfucker at the top of that hierarchy, and you want that shit. Libertarianism is, in the end, a system which inevitably leads to degeneracy.
It's totally viable and reasonable as long as Christian nationalism gets a foothold in, and we use the social powers in order to change the ideas of the politicians.
And here's the problem that you have here. We can judge history based on how long the historic standard has existed. And we can see that with Christian nations are mostly peaceful. Secular nations are fucking not peaceful. The entire historic standard of secular nations have been that they are the least peaceful nations which have ever fucking existed on planet Earth. All of them.
Where it was a command economy and directly from the state in control of everything, and that's what I was trying to figure out if that's where your Christian nationalism was heading. But
hang on, back.
I would say law enforcement would do the same thing, right? One who enforces the laws of the nation does X, Y, Z. For some reason, though, Christians can't have that. That's weird.
Well, he says no individuals or groups, and that means political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes, will be outside the state. So we're not going to be allowed to organize into any kind of association, except for the state.
So now we've covered some of the main historic events, thinkers and political ideas. Let's look a little bit more at the philosophical ideas within historic fascism. World History Project have this great explainer on fascism. I'll be using this a little bit later too, but here is their take on historic fascism for now.
Fascism comes from the Italian word fascio, which just means a bundle or sheaf. It had long been used as a political image in Europe.
This symbol has actually been involved with the US Senate since the 1700s, and that's because the symbol has an older meaning stemming from its use in ancient Rome. That meaning can be interpreted in various ways. For example, with the bundle of sticks, they're stronger together than any individual stick is. The sharp edge can be used for work and can symbolize labor, and it can also symbolize militaristic defense. The connection to Rome can also indicate an acknowledgement within politics of classical political systems, and a recognition of certain roles and responsibilities that may have been adopted from observing those forms of government. Due to its Roman connections, of course, the symbol was of great interest to the Italian fascists. When they adopted the symbol, it took on a whole new meaning. Well, a new meaning, but a related one. And ever since then, I suppose the symbol has meant something slightly different. This is similar to the swastika in the case of the Nazis, where for different cultures and religions the swastika has always meant something else, but the Nazis co-opted the symbol within their political movement, and so the symbol means something to most Europeans that even to this day it doesn't mean to people of different cultures and backgrounds.
Because a bundle of sticks is hard to break, this image was used by late 19th century Italian revolutionaries to symbolize their commitment to each other and to militant action. Then, in 1914, a copy editor and former socialist named Benito Mussolini, having turned his back on socialism, was looking for a name for his new political group. He chose Fascio Rivoluzionario d'Azione Interventista, Revolutionary League for Interventionist Action. Later, in 1919, Mussolini created the Fasci di Combattimento, or Fraternities of Combat. In this simple name, he managed to capture the sense of exclusive community they were trying to create.
Okay, so here again, I think that there is a similarity to Wilson's views, but it's not going to be exact. And that would be where there is this sense of male-dominated hierarchy and male fraternity. And within that group, it's very much about dominance and power struggle. Fortunately, it's not expressed in the same sort of militaristic way as it was in Italian fascism, but I do genuinely think that many of the same tropes of the use of martial language, the promotion of martial discourse, and thinking in that way are present still.
Can you tell me why it is that I would be wrong then, seizing power under whatever authority I wanted?
I'm not saying you'd be wrong.
Oh, okay.
Saying,
well then here's the thing.
I find it interesting.
Whatever the philosophical foundation, whatever the philosophical foundation is,
so interesting,
in which I adhere to, I guess doesn't really matter if there's no objection to Christian seizing power, right?
I have seen
the male-dominated nature of the organization and the glorification of aggression that lies at the heart of fascism. Eventually, Mussolini founded the National Fascist Party, and this was its symbol. So, now we have a better understanding of where the word fascism came from. But what is fascism? Historian Robert O. Paxton, in his book, The Anatomy...
Carneades also has this very useful video on the political philosophy of fascism.
We're going to look at the philosophy of fascism, which thrived in Italy under Mussolini from the early 1920s to the early 1940s, specifically as it was espoused by Giovanni Gentile and later Benito. Gentile wrote of a more moderate fascism before his works revised by Mussolini. So we're going to cover his fascism first and then look at Mussolini's. Fascism, in this context, was meant to provide a method of government which did not lead to the inequality of capitalism nor the class warfare of socialism. Rather, it united everyone under a strong central government. According to Gentile, the state should embody the people. All aspects of society should be part of the state. Trade federations, unions, corporations, any organizations should be made into state corporations. These organizations did not need to compete with the state or each other, but rather they needed to work together towards a common goal. If we got all of those organizations under one roof working together, they would be able to better achieve that common goal because they could work in synergy as opposed to in competition. Mussolini embraced the claim that violence was more important than belief and that violence was the best kind of propaganda. He claimed that violence was a superior method of the people to demonstrate their political wills than elections or referendums. For Mussolini, violence was something to be rejoiced in, and it was required for a nation to reach its true potential. Basically, Mussolini was making the claim that the way the government or the state should be responsive to the people is if the government is doing something the people won't like, the people will rise up and they'll overthrow the government. If the people are unable to do that, they clearly don't have severe enough grievances with the state, and the state has a right to oppress them. For Mussolini, violence was something to be rejoiced in, and it was required for the nation to reach its true potential. Mussolini's fascism opposed multilateral organizations, like at the time the League of Nations, as he thought the good nation should be ready to fight its neighbors at all times and gain glory through battle. It is important to note that while Mussolini did side with Hitler in World War II and enacted some anti-Semitic policies, this was not a central part of at least philosophical fascism. He argued individual to the state, but as a philosophy it did not advocate for racist or discriminatory policies. The term fascist can apply, in part at least, to a modern government or policymaker which subjugates the will of the people to the will of the state, one that's glorifying and promoting violence, one that claims that regime change should occur through violent revolution as opposed to democratic election, or one that's tearing down multilateral institutions, trade institutions, or things like the United Nations, of peace and cooperation in favor of more violent nationalist policies.
1.2.0 Gumming up the works. Define your terms. Defining words can be useful when two people disagree with each other, just in case one person is unsure of how the other person is using words. Some disputes around definitions are really strategic or tactical. This is where someone is actually placing on you not a demand for some further clarity, but instead they're making a potentially unreasonable demand for an essentializing characterization of something. And the problem with that is that any characterization that you give will then be susceptible to counterexamples. Now, this is highly problematic in debates about concepts that are contested politically and academically, and also concepts that are incredibly complicated and nuanced. Why would it be that we would expect there to be some simple three-word definition that covers all cases for some complicated historic term that people use? What someone who isn't so concerned about truth can do is have on hand some definition of a word that is short, snappy, punchy, and will give good optics to an audience who might be watching a debate.
So what is a woman?
Why do you ask that question?
I just really like to know.
Now, the first consequence of this sort of disingenuous definition mongering is that it completely distracts from whatever the dispute was about in the first place. Given that someone is requesting for your definition of a word, there's already some dispute on the table which is using that word in a particular kind of way. In a political context, it might be a disagreement about values. For example, what the status of women should be, what the status of transgender women should be, whether transgender women should be able to use bathrooms. What the request for a definition in a disingenuous way can do is completely distract from the clash of values and the first order concern that's on the table, and basically turn the dispute into this game of who can provide the definition with the best optics for an uninformed audience, right? Who projects power in the best kind of way when asked the question, what is X? Turning the dispute into some kind of semantic dispute about definitions is something that bad faith actors can use in order to essentially gum up the works, right? So part of the reason of using a word like fascism might be to provide pushback on incredibly harmful politics that someone is promoting. But if someone makes an unreasonable request for a particular type of definition, one that can never be satisfied, well then the whole dispute can be stuck in this never-ending cycle of demands for this sort of definition that can never be gotten past, right? That can never be provided. This is all very convenient for someone who's a fascist, right? Fascism is broadly agreed upon, is very bad politically, and it incentivizes people to dislike that politics if it's agreed upon that it's fascist. However, if no one can ever define the word fascism to the satisfaction of fascists, well then they can never be accused of being fascist, right? Because no one can ever produce a definition that would satisfy them. Now, this is not to say that all requests for defining terms are disingenuous. There are legitimate requests where people might think that they're talking past each other or may have some issue with the way that someone is using a word. Now, given such a good faith request, there are still assumptions that might be going on there, right? For example, if someone thinks that there might be some necessary and sufficient conditions for defining a word in an essentialist sort of way. The problem, as I've already said, is that for complicated concepts, it may not be the case that there are some necessary and sufficient conditions, but instead there might be many somewhat sufficient conditions for the application of a word, or, a cluster of concepts which taken together and at some kind of threshold, but it's not, a specific and quantifiable threshold, it becomes that sort of thing. And the problem is that there are a lot of words that are like this, and there's quite a good philosophical basis for thinking this way, right? The metaphor of family resemblance, which is given by Ludwig Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations, is one that has had much utility in politics and in the sciences. In their popular psycholinguistics book, The Language Game, Nick Chater and Morten H. Christensen give the following example. They say, "There is no common essence from which family members are all slight variations. There are only crisscrossing patterns of similarities. Think of the word light. A light breakfast, lunch, supper, and snack are clearly closely connected by being of modest calorific value. Similarly, light tanks, light frigates, and light infantry are connected regarding maneuverability, speed of movement, and lack of armor. The flexibility with which we redeploy language also shines through in the Navajo code talkers' names for military terms. For example, dahi-tihi, the word for hummingbird, is used to denote a fighter plane, while jay-sho, the word for buzzard, refers to a bomber. Similarly, kalo, shark, refers to a destroyer, while lo-tso, whale, means a battleship. The Navajo language doesn't have a vocabulary for military terms, but such terms can easily be co-opted from existing vocabulary given the human capacity for playing charades." Chater and Christensen talk about some of the contemporary evidence from linguistics and cognitive science, backing up the claim that words work more in this family resemblance way than in this essentializing way that might underpin some requests for essentializing definitions.
Picture 3. Language as family resemblance. Wittgenstein challenges the idea that language is governed by strict definitions. He writes, "Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Now, don't say there must be something common or they wouldn't all be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common. You won't see something that is common to all, but you'll see similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. Just as family members share overlapping features that help us recognize them, so, for Wittgenstein, do the concepts we use. And here he's talking about games, but see how justice on a football pitch has a family resemblance to justice in the court of law and justice in a turf war. There isn't a single essence, but a network of similarities lets us recognize it when we see it."
This error of assuming that words do have essentializing definitions has wrought philosophical problems throughout the ages, as James Clegg explains in his lecture where he contrasts Socrates and Wittgenstein.
So Wittgenstein had a lot of interest in and familiarity with Plato's dialogues. Socrates, in Plato's early dialogues, regularly asks, what is X, whether that be virtue or piety or knowledge, and I construe this as a request for a definition. Give me the definition of virtue or the definition of knowledge or definition of piety. But Socrates' interlocutors, that is the people he spoke with, initially respond to his request only with examples or instances of the term. So when he asks what is virtue, Meno says, well, there's the virtue of men, and there's virtue of husbands, and virtue of slaves, and so forth. And when when Socrates asks the Euthyphro, what is piety? Euthyphro famously answers, well, it's what I'm doing right now. And so these are just giving examples or illustrations. They're not really giving definitions. Socrates always responds by pushing the interlocutor for a definition that provides what we would call an essence, or what philosophers would call an essence, a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for the term under discussion.
Kane Baker has raised similar worries when talking about problems for conceptual analysis as it's practiced in philosophy.
So, for much of the 20th century, the central method of analytic philosophy was considered to be conceptual analysis. Conceptual analysis involves breaking concepts down into their constituent parts and attempting to find necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of the concept. Essentially, this involves finding the definition of the concept. But second, there's the objection that concepts are simply not structured in such a way as to have necessary and sufficient conditions of application. The assumption of conceptual analysis is that concepts work like definitions, but there are other views of conceptual structure. So, a popular view in psychology is what's known as the prototype theory. According to prototype theory, a particular item falls under some concept just in case it shares a sufficient but vague number of properties with the exemplars of that concept, with typical cases of that concept. So, take the concept fruit. Apples and oranges are exemplar fruits. They are typical fruits, at least for those of us in the English-speaking world. We all immediately recognise apples and oranges as fruits. And if somebody asked you to think of a fruit, you may well initially think of an apple or an orange. Now, other items in the world are then judged to be fruits on the basis of relevant similarities with these exemplar fruits, and on the basis of relevant differences with exemplar items of other categories. So, relevant differences with exemplar vegetables. So, naturally then, this generates unclear cases, right? I mean, think of tomatoes and avocados. And notice that even once you accept a precise definition of the term fruit, and you see that under that definition a tomato is technically a fruit, you're still not likely to refer to it as a fruit in your everyday interactions, right? So once you learn that, by some technical definition of the term fruit, a tomato is a fruit, even so, in your everyday interactions and your everyday thinking about the world, you're probably still going to conceive of it as a vegetable, unless you work in botany, right? The concept that you actually use most of the time is not a technical definition. Now, if this view, or something like it, is right, then many concepts will not even have necessary and sufficient conditions of application. And, if a concept as simple as fruit is vague in this kind of way, it would surely be foolish to expect precision from concepts like, knowledge or justice or explanation or many of the other things that create philosophical puzzles.
So providing definitions can actually be an incredibly difficult task. If the request is simply to clarify some minor point of disagreement, sure, providing a definition might be easy, but if the request is to provide a definition that covers all possible cases and exhaustively covers some concept, well then that demand might be unrealistic or impossible, even for very basic concepts. Now, I think that the concept of fascism in politics and political philosophy is very much like this, right? Fascism is historical. It's also something that has causal connections and relationships to other sorts of political movements and concerns. You may hear words such as authoritarianism or populism coming up in these sorts of discussions. And while sure, we don't want to say it's anything goes when it comes to fascism, the boundaries on what we consider fascism or not are going to be blurry, and it's probably going to be difficult to pick out some necessary conditions for something to be fascism. And so we're going to be able to find a whole bunch of properties that we would consider to be fascistic in a political ideology, but it's not going to be clear how many or what combination of these properties are required for something to be truly fascism. And that's because we're engaged in interrogating language, really. We're not performing a titration with chemicals or measuring something with a ruler, right? And I think if we try to sort of sit back and observe the many different uses for fascism within politics, well then we have to ask, to what end is this word being deployed and used in any particular context, right? And whilst it might be the case that in certain academic contexts, in particular academic disciplines concerned with history, that very precise historic conceptualizations might be valuable and important for the inquiry within that discipline, outside of that discipline in different domains, it may not be the case that such a precise characterization is even useful. So when we look at more ordinary uses of fascism in the political domain, the way that we see it being used is to invoke that historic memory of a group of political movements which were so harmful and so morally repugnant that we do not want to permit them in our political landscape, and that if we identify them again today, we want there to be some kind of drastic call to political action to stop these movements from taking hold, right? It's a canary in the coal mine politically if you have fascism cropping up. This is something Jason Stanley explains.
You know, there was last decade had kind of what we call the fascism debate, where people were like, is this just authoritarianism or is it fascism? And in a way, my own view now is we need to get away. There's a total waste of time, because it's very clear that what we're seeing is dangerous far-right authoritarianism, and no one should care at all what you call it. But labels like right-wing authoritarianism or labels like populism, right-wing populism, are really bad because they don't convey the threat. They're ways of whitewashing the threat. What we have is a far-right authoritarianism. I've argued in detail in my book that it fits the label of fascism, but I really think it's a distraction right now.
The problem, though, is always going to be that there's no scientific test for these concepts. Their use and our understanding of them is always going to be vague and contested to some degree. I'm going to try to add some content to the bones of what fascism is going forward, but there's going to be aspects of this that are entirely up for grabs. And it's important to note that recognizing this is still different from saying that it's anything goes, or that it's okay for me to use the label fascism for any kind of politics that I disagree with. In fact, in the Objections section, I'm going to cover this line of disagreement because I think it's a very convenient weapon that some people use to say, oh, so just anything you disagree with is fascism, people shouldn't pay any attention to you. So with all that being said about the rhetoric around providing definitions and what realistic demands might be, let's get into some academic discussions of what fascism is. 1.3.0 Academic Criteria. In this section, I'm going to attempt to characterize fascism in a way that it could apply to contemporary politics and not just historic fascism. I shall do this by engaging with the works of various academics. 1.3.1 Jason Stanley.
My name is Jason Stanley. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. My name is Jason Stanley. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Hi, my name is Jason Stanley. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. My name is Jason Stanley. I'm a teacher in the philosophy department here at Yale University. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy. I'm the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, and the author of 5 books, most recently, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them.
While Jason Stanley was the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, he has recently left the US during Trump's second terms because of his political concerns, moving to Canada. However, during Trump's first term, he did publish the book, How Fascism Works, and within that book, he offers 10 criteria for political fascism. So what are Stanley's 10 characteristics of fascism? They are 1. The mythic past. 2. Propaganda. 3. Anti-intellectualism. 4. Unreality. 5. Hierarchy. 6. Victimhood. 7. Law and order. 8. Sexual anxiety. 9. Sodom and Gomorrah. And 10. Arbeit macht frei. He explains in more detail here.
All nationalism involves a mythic past. So you can say, that's a fine mythic past, but then there's the fascist mythic past. In the past, we were great. Wherein did our greatness consist? In our military. And in the past, the dominant racial group ruled over others. And then the fascist leader says, that has been taken from you by the leftists and communists.
So note here that Stanley is not saying that the construction of a mythical past is sufficient for something to be fascist. He's also saying that there are somewhat potentially healthy forms of mythical past that can be constructed. He's saying that there's a certain extreme form of this, which also includes something like a rebirth of the nation. And even in the examples he gives, he's not saying that it's necessary that that myth involve militarism or even racialism, but just that they typically do.
Very much. And he was very much an Indian killer. And he was very much this shit is ours because I have the gun and we're going to take this shit by force. But he did not want industrialists and rich bankers who were controlling industrialists to come in and take over his fucking nation that we had conquered from the savages. And the government, which was in power, which was there to represent the people. That's what they were there to do.
And he's not saying that the enemy necessarily be communists or Jews.
And you've told the people who are coming into the nation who just got here fucking yesterday that they're in the oppressed class, and then you tell them to go fucking riot and scream about it, even though they're not in the oppressed class. That's what color revolutions are. That's what you fucking Marxists do.
I'm not a Marxist, right? Who's telling them that?
Usually the hard left and leftist Marxists. The same type who organized the King's Rally, by the way.
And what you're saying is that just by the fact that they have magic Jew blood, God loves them more than you.
Now you are making fun of the Bible.
No, that's not, listen, that's not biblical.
You're literally making fun.
But that there is some othering group that's created and conspiratorial thinking around their nefarious aims that are destroying the nation.
Propaganda is ubiquitous and everyone uses propaganda. In political propaganda, your main message is something other than the information you're conveying. Fascist propaganda is a very particular structure. It's based around a friend-enemy distinction. The political opponent, they are a merciless threat to your very existence and your traditions.
I'm talking about communists in the United States. Communists in the United States.
Oh, you're talking about just in the United States?
Yeah, have already subverted power.
Okay,
but they didn't need to
education
change.
Systems.
Yeah, they didn't need to change any of the democratic structures because the same weapons they use, we can use. Yeah, but I mean, Marxist and propaganda and media.
Okay, because I was thinking you're saying
the propaganda and media means more than anything. It's the social power that matters. It's the media power that matters.
Right.
The propaganda that matters.
You can
not
also
the
choose.
law.
You can also choose between Fox News and.
So the structure, fascist propaganda, is based on the idea that the other are fundamentally opposed to the nation. This is only useful insofar as it strengthens the nation. Fascism is a cult of the leader. It involves the leader setting the rules about what's true and false. So any kind of expertise, reality, all of that is a challenge to the authority of the leader.
So not just Marxists in academia.
Institutions that teach multiple perspectives on history in all its complexity are always a threat to the fascist leader. The center of democracy is truth. You're not free if you've been lied to. Equality similarly requires truth. Because equality in democracy doesn't mean we all have the same amount of money. It doesn't mean we all have the same car. It means political equality, that each of our voices matters the same. So if you're going to rip the heart out of democracy, you get people used to lies.
Now, I think either Stanley's criteria here is somewhat unfortunate, or the video that's been produced left out some relevant parts. But the point that Stanley is raising is that unreality is a sort of state that needs to be produced in terms of unsettling people's ability to discern what's true in order to bring about fascism in politics. This is with the aim of undermining democracy and bringing about a state of affairs where everyone is not in fact politically equal in society. I think Stanley does a better job of articulating this point when he talks about Vladislav Surkov and his information warfare campaign in a separate lecture.
In his book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, Peter Pomerantsev, the British journalist who worked in Russia for many years, says that Vladislav Surkov's motto was, the way he ran Putin's propagandist, political technologist, his motto is democratic rhetoric with undemocratic intent. So the Kremlin was constantly supporting there'd be an opposition group, and then you'd find out that the Kremlin actually was, behind that opposition group. So everyone got hope, and then the goal was to crush that hope. But what Russia wants to say is democracy is a facade. Surkov has two pictures on his desk. One is of Putin, and can you guess who the other is of? Does anyone know? Tupac. Because of course, rightly or wrongly, Surkov wants everyone to know that America is a white supremacist nation, and its facade of democracy is just that, a facade. And he likes Tupac. So this opposite thing is characteristic of fascist propaganda. There's a fact about humans. We all pretty much suck to the same degree. One group of us is not better than another group of us. Hierarchy is central here because it's the big lie at the center of things. What is racism but one big lie? Racism is the lie that one group is better than another. You're told this religion is better, this race is better, this gender is better.
Rather unfortunately here, I think that Andrew Wilson actually makes all three of those claims, that certain ethnicities are better, that certain religions are better, and that certain genders are better.
How many times do I have to tell you?
So you're
it's
absolutely
irrelevant to me.
Just like me then. You just don't want people breaking the law.
Am I going to immigrate a bunch of fucking Indians? Because they sure have the same ethical system as me, said nobody ever. Or Arabs? No, they don't have the same ethical systems either.
They will, so...
No, they don't, though. This whole cultural assimilation shit that you have tried to push has not worked.
Now, there is something to say about the way that he caveats his claims about ethnicity, and I'll get onto those in the section specifically on Wilson's views.
But when you look at history, white males are disproportionately part of the story. But you think of Braveheart and William the Conqueror and Jesus Christ.
Famous white guy Jesus. I think Gavin McGuinness is going to be incredibly disappointed if he ever reads about the historical origins of Christianity or the ethnic groups that comprised first century Palestine.
And, St. Andrew and all of these different, they just seem to be at the forefront of most stories in history. So maybe it's natural that you have Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and it looks reasonable, because that's what's been happening in history. Well, and they would see white males in power, and they would go, well, that's clearly a racism.
Sure.
If all these white males are successful, then they must be getting a red carpet. Mm-hmm. Maybe they are better at politics, white males. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're better in story.
Once you have hierarchy set up, you can make people very nervous and frightened about losing their position. Hierarchy goes right into victimhood, because once you convince people that they are justifiably higher on the hierarchy, then you can tell them that they're victims of equality.
Yes, mostly from women.
And do you think that calling men victims then empowers them to justify their own failings that they actually could control?
No. There's a distinction here. Men are actual victims because of the single motherhood epidemic. We can point to the actual thing that they were the victims of, which is women. They were the victims of women who decided that they were going to be fucking empowered by embracing single motherhood, not because of anything other than I had irreconcilable differences with my actually pretty good husband, who I just decided to get rid of because I wanted to fuck Chad down the street.
Okay, what if...
I bloody hate women, you gay boy.
People getting the correct counseling in your church. Don't worry. We have a special counselor, faith counselor, come in and help assist, train you away from things like conversion therapy, this type of thing, right?
My favorite part of the Bible is when Jesus uses conversion therapy to stop himself having the complete fullness of love in unity in the Holy Trinity between Theos, God the Father, and himself. And when he uses the definitely in the Bible, definitely science of conversion therapy to take away his love towards the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is, of course, against nature.
So these are special interest groups by secularist organization and atheist organizations, which are trying to infiltrate the church to exercise power. We're just offering to do the same thing in reverse.
Yes, this thing is definitely happening. And so it's fair and just for you to have a secret coup of all US institutions and government. And you're right that that wouldn't even be bad, because it would just be the exact same thing that has definitely been happening to you, because there isn't a Republican president in power.
Okay, how about we send in our non-government organizations and we say, hey, look, OnlyFans people, let us give you some training on how to get the fuck out of OnlyFans, right? Let us do the same thing, just in the opposite direction. Let us push forward the values and ideas that we have.
German Christians are victims of Jews. White Americans are victims of black American equality.
The left has seized every major institution, absent one, which is the church.
So I literally have no idea why Andrew is saying this. Now, I think this was recorded before Trump's election, but obviously now Trump is the president, so controls the executive branch. The military is packed out with Republican generals. The FBI is controlled by someone sympathetic to Trump. Because of accusations of lawfare and in the name of fairness, Biden had appointed many Republicans to positions of power. The House of Representatives is now a Republican majority, and it's been about that for a long time. The Senate is a Republican majority. The Supreme Court is also a Republican majority.
But there is no the church in the United States. That's the problem. There's a huge faction of different Protestant churches, many of which have a lot of power, but they're bribed. They become, LGBTQ infiltrated, rainbow flag having churches, this type of thing. There's nothing core for conservatives to conserve. What are they trying to conserve? It's all gone. There's nothing there. There's no majority. So if you were an ethno-nationalist, there's no more white.
So here, whilst Andrew is lamenting the fact that one can't be an ethno-nationalist anymore because there's no more white majority, again, this just isn't true. According to the United States Census Bureau, in 2024, the ethnic demography of the US was that 75.3% of people are white alone. Now, I don't know what Andrew's criteria are for a majority, but I consider 75.3% to be a majority, so there is a white majority in the US. The next highest ethnic category is black alone at 13.7%, so by no means is there a white minority, or are the numbers of individuals even close to any other ethnicity.
Majority, that's done. So what are you trying to conserve? There is no more capitalist society anymore. It's a blended economic society now.
Again, this claim just seems wildly out of kilter with reality. Sure, there are some minimal laws governing what markets can do in the US, but if you compare the US to the EU, a free market capitalist economy, then by contrast, the US is frankly the Wild West. Maybe Andrew has in mind here something like, if there is any form of regulation on markets, well then it doesn't count as a capitalist economy. Well, that's just out of line with how almost any economist would think about these things, apart from maybe a few fringe extremists.
With free healthcare, free this, free that, all sorts of state aid.
Yeah, any Americans watching this, let me know how well all that free healthcare is going for you that you definitely do get. And that if you were to get it, it would be a bad thing, because conservatism is about no free healthcare.
It's a blended economy now. So what are we conserving? There's no conservation anywhere. Conservatism's dead. We'd have to retake back everything.
Then you can tell them that equality is actually victimhood.
Not anymore, though. Now you have color revolutions because fucking Marxists are crazy, but...
Okay, for this part, I'm going to invent a drinking game so you can play along with this at home. The drinking game is, every time that Andrew Wilson mentions fucking colour revolutions as if he's trapped inside a United Colours of Benetton advert, you have to drink. If Andrew mentions Marxists, you have to take 2 drinks. If Andrew blames women for something that may be his own fault, then cry in despair. Japan?
Yeah, tell me how they're worse off. Where's their color revolutions, riots, protests in the streets? Where are they?
You said culturally homogenous.
We have color revolutions every 2 fucking years. We have people in the streets. This whole, diversity is our strength doesn't seem to be working out so great.
Ah, yes, the whole diversity is our strength. I hate it when the diversity is our strength is in the road, and when the diversity is our strength gets in the way of my daily routines. I really hope the current politicians sort out the diversity is our strength.
All this diversity is our strength. When we see nothing but rioting, and fucking color revolutions every couple of years. How does that make us a stronger nation, dude? The problem of rioting in the streets every couple of years and color revolutions from people who aren't even a member of their nation.
law and order in fascist politics means the members of the minority group who accept their subservient role, they're law-abiding, and the members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are law-abiding.
What's going on here, though, is that you have foreigners who are flying a foreign flag in our nation who aren't even supposed to be here. That is that. And by the way, they're firebombing police cars. They're doing things now.
Just to fact check myself here as well, I am right that Gavin Newsom legally has the right to make an appeal in the court, as he did. But since I had this conversation, the appeals court has dealt with the case and said that Trump had the right to use the National Guard. I actually still think that that should be incredibly worrying that the higher court did rule that way, but that's another topic for another day, right?
Yeah, he tried, but he didn't have any authority. Is he doing that's fascist here?
Just as Gavin Newsom legally has the power to push back on that, right?
Yeah, he tried, but he didn't have any authority. He has no authority to do it.
In process, right? So...
Well, no, it's not in process. The protests are done. They fizzled. And you know why they fizzled? They fizzled out. I watched them die on Saturday night. And you know why they died? Because there was fucking military everywhere, and they were bussing these fuckers out by the drove.
So as much as Andrew is creaming himself here at the idea of military force being used against citizens of the United States who happen to politically disagree with him, I just think Andrew's explanation here is completely wrong. There were planned protests for a single day. That was Trump's birthday, where there was a military march planned. Now, many people had planned in advance of attending these protests. I actually believe that given the issues in Los Angeles and the high-profile news story surrounding that with Trump sending in the National Guard and then the Marines, that probably incentivized a lot of Americans who knew about the protests on King's Day to go and protest what they saw as an overreach of federal power where they otherwise wouldn't have. Regardless of that, Trump ordered the National Guard to go to LA to stop the protests. Andrew uses several different terms. He will say riots, but also he claims that it's actually an invasion from a foreign country, right? So it would be a war zone. So if it's an invasion, it would be an active war zone, which, how ridiculous that obviously is, highlights the way that Andrew's playing fast and loose with words and just lying through his teeth to establish a political conclusion that he wants to. He has no idea what proportion of the people protesting are US citizens or are not US citizens. That's part of the whole problem with the racism of ICE agents and of MAGA supporters generally, where they're advocating for people being snatched without due process and disappeared. So that's just to say that any kind of accurate political analysis of what's going on is basically impossible with Andrew, because you have to wade through this treacle of all his violent fantasies and conspiracy theories about what's going on and the people who he disagrees with and how they're connected to this thing, before you can even have any reasonable adult discussion about what's actually going on in a clear way. Which is that the Skittles people from the United Colors of Benetton's ad have escaped, and they are teaching the Mexicans communism whilst infiltrating the church and stopping them from doing conversion therapy as Jesus Christ taught.
By definition, the leader can't violate law and order. So law and order doesn't mean justice. Law and order doesn't mean equality. Law and order structures who's legitimate and who's not.
And the state governor, but the state governor can't trump the federal powers of the executive branch. They're the ones who fund the military. They're all federal government employees.
This question isn't about what people legally can do, and I agree with you, there's an irony to this, right, in terms of what people have argued for historically. What I'm asking you, though, is how do you think it should be?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't have any problem with the president calling up the militia to quell rebellion. If you're having your own police officers stand down like they just send in fucking troops to bring back law and order. He should have done that during the BLM. If you're having your own police officers stand down like they did during the BLM riots and let people burn shit to the ground, it's totally appropriate to send in fucking troops to bring back law and order. He should have done that during the BLM riots. That's what people were demanding he do.
Everywhere around the world, no matter what the situation is, in very different socioeconomic conditions, the fascist leader comes and tells you, your women and children are under threat. You need a strong man to protect your families.
The idea of mommy, daddy being at home with kids, right? No alternative lifestyle units, anti-abortion, right? Things like this. It's the degeneracy and decadence which seems to be targeted.
They make conservatives hysterically afraid of transgender rights or homosexuality, other ways of living. These are not people trying to live their own lives. They're trying to destroy your life, and they're coming after your children. what the fascist politician does is they take conservatives who aren't fascist at all, and they say, look, I know you might not like my ways. You might think I'm a womanizer. You might think I'm violent in my rhetoric, but you need someone like me now. You need someone like me because homosexuality, it isn't just trying for equality. It's coming after your family.
Run. Thanks, Nathan.
I'm just curious too. Hey, Nathan, when are you going to start wearing adult diapers? I'm just curious for your, anal leakage. Is that something that's coming soon, or is that already being done? Dude, bro, you wish you had a wife, but don't you have a husband? Isn't that your gig? You keep taking your shirt off in front of men. Maybe you're just a little drowsy from last night's speed run gangbang. But why don't you calm the fuck down, bro?
A joke, sensitive man.
They're funny, Jay Dyer.
Oh my God! Look at this behavior. This behavior is out of control.
You are too gay.
It's too much bad behavior.
Wait, I'm sorry. Reason for it. It's silly. It has never really been about gay rights. It's
what do you mean
about
there's no
weird,
reason for it? What do you mean?
It's
what do you
been.
mean there's no
It's
reason?
been. Well, because it's always
there's
really
no
been
reason
about
for it?
with homosexuals themselves not having rights or having rights. It's never been about that. It's been about weird gay pride parades and all kinds of weird sexual stuff. It really has never been about that. And that's what the American people think. That's what they see. That's why you see companies moving away from it.
No, I don't think that's true. Look, they're gay people like let's take you, for example. You're the reason, right?
If both me and Jay Dyer, both of us assumed that you were a homosexual and both of us were right. That's what's so funny about it. We both assumed you were gay, and we were both correct that you were gay.
Andrew, is there anything wrong with him being gay?
Huh?
Is there anything wrong with him being gay?
There's a problem with you guys supporting NGO-funded kind of AstroTurf program to promote rights, which aren't even about promoting rights.
Fascist movements typically, though not invariably, rest on an urban-rural divide. The cities are where there's decadence, where the elites congregate, where there's immigrants, there's criminality, there's Sodom and Gomorrah.
So I think this point about the general corruption of the liberal elite city folk versus the wholesomeness of the rural real folk who understand American values and family is probably a point that Andrew buys into, but I can't find any clear-cut clips where he's saying something like that, and I've spent so much time on this video, I can't be bothered doing so. But I'm pretty confident it's something he believes, and if he ever watches this video and says, well, you found clips of all these 9 other points, but actually that one is one that I don't believe, he can say so. But, here's a question, Andrew. Do you think that that's true?
Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free. This was written on the gates of Auschwitz. The idea is that the minority group, they're lazy and they need to be made to work. Free labor. The minority group and the leftists, they're lazy by their nature, and it gives them a work ethic.
If it's giving to sort of a public good. So like property tax to pay for roads, that's not theft. But property tax, presumably you would say this, property tax to pay for welfare for single mothers, that would be theft, or to pay for LGBT issues or something like that. So he's saying, why isn't the property tax always theft? And you seem to be saying it's only theft if that money is given to particular entities. He's asking why that's the case.
Oh, based on immutable versus non-immutable. So
each of these individual elements is not in and of itself fascist, but you have to worry when they're all grouped together. When honest conservatives are lured into fascism by people who tell them, look, it's an existential fight. I know you don't accept everything we do, you don't accept every doctrine, but your family is under threat. Your family is at risk. So without us, you're in peril. Those moments are the times when we need to worry about fascism.
Okay, so I've already used some of the World History Project's content in the section on historic fascism, but there's a little bit more to their video, so I thought I would include it here.
Historian Robert O. Paxton, in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, came up with this definition. That's a long paragraph, so let's take it one bit at a time. First, Paxton calls fascism a form of political behavior. He is telling us that it is important to pay attention to what fascists do and not just what they say. Fascist leaders like Mussolini and Adolf Hitler gave dramatic speeches and produced manifestos. But these do not tell us much about how they actually acquired and used power.
So note here one consistent theme that is coming up, which is the concern for power and a lack of concern for principle. World History Project are using Robert Paxton's criteria for fascism, and in the next section on Robert Paxton, I'm going to look at his 5 stages of fascism.
Fascist behavior aims to bring together different groups of angry, discontented extremists and to figure out how to get them to work with each other. How can they convince people to let them change society and commit atrocities, or at least get them to not resist?
So this is an important and interesting point, and I think it comes up in an interview with Andrew Wilson, where he explicitly talks about his desires to do this.
What do you mean?
Like, what's the difference between what you're saying and...
Because right now Christianity is not the dominant social force of the United States. The aim of Christian nationalism is to make it so.
Now here, I don't exactly know what Andrew means by this. Christianity has obviously had the biggest influence on US politics, and the latest US Pew Research polls show that 63% of US adults still identify as Christian. However, in 2007, that was 78%. Christians have shaped the institutions and values of the US through and through. But my point here isn't to challenge Andrew's constant invocation of false information and grievance mongering, but I want people to pay attention to what he has to say about his proposed way of growing his ideology and seizing power through political institutions.
So these are special interest groups by secularist organization and atheist organizations, which are trying to infiltrate the church to exercise power. We're just offering to do the same thing in reverse. Okay, how about we send in our non-government organizations? Let us do the same thing, just in the opposite direction. Let us push forward the values and ideas that we have.
No, I mean, look, what I'm hearing...
So does the prosecution rest?
Well, what I'm hearing is I don't want to change anything. I just want to get people to agree with me and get into places of power and then change...
So what you heard from me is I don't want to change anything, really?
Well, no. I don't want to change anything as far as the structure of democratic republic.
Yeah, just like the communists. The communists used and subverted the structure of power. I'm saying Christians are also going to use and subvert the structure of power.
But then, once they had control, they completely went into complete power. Where it was a command economy and directly from the state in control of everything. And that's what I was trying to figure out, if that's where your Christian nationalism was heading. But
that's just how the system works.
See what happens.
It's totally viable. It's totally viable and reasonable as long as Christian nationalism gets a foothold in. And we use the social powers in order to change the ideas of the politicians, much like the Marxists did.
I spoke to Stephen Wolfe on my channel.
Why?
You know who Stephen Wolfe is?
Yeah.
He wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first off, I don't know.
I have the book.
What do you think of Stephen Wolfe and the book and his ideas?
I think he makes some good points. I think he makes a good point through the idea of coercive structure, Christianity is
properly ordered.
Yeah, there's the only thing which can ultimately exist for the stability of a society long term. I think he's right.
One answer, Paxton says, is that fascists spin messages about community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and say that they can unify, energize, and purify this community.
This theme of victimhood and victimization comes up again. I'll go into it in more detail and how it relates to Wilson's views in the relevant section under Jason Stanley's work.
But in order to benefit from people's anger or sense of victimhood, they must first tell a story about who is a member of the community and who is not.
Now, this will be a difference between Wilson's views and historic fascist movements. I think that for Wilson, a particular kind of theofascism plays this role. He has radical and extreme fundamentalist beliefs, and this radical and extreme fundamentalism, with respect to his theology, is how he goes about defining the nation.
In late 19th and early 20th century Europe, ideas about race provided the easiest, you might say laziest, way to think about who could belong to a community. Once fascists had defined the nation in terms of race, they could claim to know how to purify and strengthen the nation.
Again, similarly, I think that this is basically what Andrew is doing with his theology. Now that he has defined the nation in terms of his radical theology, he has prescriptions about how to strengthen and purify the Christian nation.
And justify radical violence to exclude or eliminate those perceived as outsiders.
Can you tell me why it is that I would be wrong then, seizing power under whatever authority I wanted?
Direction. Let us push forward the values and ideas that we have. And if you're willing to use force for your ideals, you can't then be hypocritical and say we can't use force for our ideals.
I think you can say you shouldn't do that, but obviously escalating in this way is literally escalating towards physical conflict. I mean, when you're talking about using force in this respect, the only avenue that you're leaving open for the people that you disagree with to protect themselves from the force you want to use with your values is for them to use force in return.
Of course, in order to convince the public that their stories about race and nation were right and true, fascists had to challenge other stories.
So this channel called Ryan Chapman has a really great video where he goes through some of the philosophical influences upon fascism. I'm not going to go through everything in the video, but there are some key parts which I think can aid in my analysis that some of my other sources miss.
It's into reality, the force of its spirit of the nation. So then I think it's natural to ask, what do they mean by making the country great? And fascists tended to leave that answer pretty vague. Here's Mussolini saying, the nation is great when it translates into reality the force of its spirit. So this is a Hegelian idea. The idea that history is marked by stages, and those stages are defined by the human spirit. And going to Hegel now, spirit is the director of the events of the world's history. So spirit directs the world's history and drives it forward. So Italian fascists aspired to use the force of the Italian people to make an impact on the history of the world. If they did that, they would be translating into reality the force of the Italian spirit, which was supposed to make history, which was supposed to make Italy great and the Italian people great. To understand exactly,
I think that some of these themes of the spirit of purity can be found in Wilson's theological beliefs, but it's this next section where I think there's a really stark resemblance with what Wilson believes.
So Hegel argued that you need a strong state in order to manifest the will of the people and embody the spirit of the nation and to drive history forward. So then you might ask, what makes a state powerful? And here's Hegel's answer. A state is well constituted and internally powerful when the private interest of its citizens is one with the common interest of the state. So if the citizens and the state have identical interests, that makes the state powerful, which Hegel calls a desired harmony. He then says, the epoch, when a state attains this harmonious condition, marks the period of its bloom, its virtue, its vigor, and its prosperity. So according to this philosophy, the goal is to create a unity of interests between individuals and the state, so there's no conflict between individuals and the state. And if there is a conflict, then the state wins. As Hegel put it, this unified state as an ultimate end possesses the highest right in relation to individuals, whose highest duty is to be members of the state. So Italian fascists were directly inspired by that philosophy. They saw the state as a means to their end of making the nation great, and thought that individuals should be subordinated to the needs of the state. What those needs were determined by fascists, since it was a fascist state.
Christians are getting rid of things like abortion, smut movies, things like this. They can do that through social power. It's just the realization that Christians have the social power to
Christian nationalism.
I hope not.
They're not moving. No, that's not really what it's moving towards. What they're moving towards is the idea of regulation of human behavior, especially in the physical zones, mostly geared towards degeneracy and the idea of procreative marriage. That seems to be the primary feasible message of Christian ethics and the idea of Christian nationalism.
That you could have a perfect authoritarianism, at least in theory, where most of this type of stuff doesn't happen. Or you can have pure democracy where all of this stuff does happen. Or you could have perfect democracy where none of this stuff happens. And this is because I think that most of it revolves around the moral foundation of the people group who push these types of, in other words, I don't think necessarily any single type of government is more or less immoral. Rather, the people which prop the government up are more or less immoral.
Chapman also gives his own criteria for fascism at the end, and to be honest, I quite like it. I think it places an interesting emphasis on the aesthetic side of things, and I also think it's relatively illuminating with respect to Wilson's views.
Fascism being used loosely probably isn't going away anytime soon, but among those of us who care, those of us who want to be able to identify it correctly, in my opinion, this is fascism. The ideology that we think with the blood of our nation. Thank you.
Well, how does that make us a stronger nation, dude? The best thing that I can do is affect my people group in my nation, who are my people group, so that they get the best for themselves. That's, I mean, it's a war of tribes, man. And I'm an American, and I'm an American firster. I care about guys like you doing as good as possible. I'm not going to entangle myself in the foreign affairs of others. European nations have porn playing. European nations have porn playing.
What Islam did to Charlie Hebdo? Do you think that was an acceptable
I think that
response?
is in Islamic nations, if you believe in the sovereignty of men, and those men have constructed that nation under Islam, then you're going to have to obey their laws. I don't have to agree. Hang on.
So you, okay,
bro, you got to let me answer the fucking question.
Oh, okay. We're in debate mode now, Andrew.
Do I agree though that you should be able to regulate again? No, but I'm
1.3.4 Robert Paxton. So Robert Paxton's definition of fascism has already been mentioned, but here I'm going to look at a lecture that's given on his work on the 5 stages of fascism. This lecture's on the channel Sisyphus Redeemed, and it's really good. I highly recommend people check it out.
Giving a clear, unambiguous definition of fascism is particularly challenging, and Paxton would argue actually probably a fool's errand. You cannot pinpoint a single specific doctrine or set of doctrines that say this is what fascism is, because fascism, unlike conservatism, liberalism, or socialism, has no core principles. Now, there are people who have been fascist who have claimed these are the core principles of fascism, and they will write essays espousing the philosophy of fascism. Benito Mussolini wrote a book on that, saying that this is what fascism is about. But this is the tricky thing, according to Paxton, is that fascists are under no obligation to actually abide by what they claim their principles to be. They will say they believe one thing, and then a short time later they will turn around and espouse the exact opposite. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, according to the fascists. There's no problem with completely changing your position on various issues or stances, as long as you keep abiding by some sort of general fascist tendencies, which I will explain as we go along through this essay. So, in other words, fascism is something that molds itself to the particular exigencies of the moment. It will take different shapes in different cultures at different times, and as the political realities start to change, fascism will adjust to change with them.
So I think a lot of this has been highlighted where I've raised the unrealistic demands for essentializing definitions, and also the sort of amorphous nature of fascism itself. I also want to bring attention to when we look at contemporary fascists, like people like Andrew Wilson, who I claim are examples of contemporary fascists, we see this outright obsession and interest with holding, gaining, seizing, using power and domination. That is over and above principles and reason, and that's consistent with Paxton's characterization of fascism.
But the full cycle of 5 is something that's only happened twice in history. Now, in the earliest stages of fascism, it is the ideas that count. This is when the intellectuals and the ideologues start sort of having the most important role to play. And when you read fascist philosophy, you will often see that it is in these early stages that they actually play the larger role. They make things like promises of renewal and reinvigoration of a nation that was once glorious but has since been crushed and defeated. Again, you can sort of imagine how this is going to sit well in Italy, right? They used to be the Roman Empire, and now, at the dawn of the 20th century, they were just one among many fairly petty European nations with their squabbles. So the promise of restoring Italy to its Roman glory is something that sounded really good to a lot of Italians who kind of felt like they had been let down by the recent history and recent politicians. There's a call for a invigoration to transform the nation. And then as the different parties start to get political traction, the purity has to be sacrificed and compromises have to be made and ideas have to be thrown out the window to adjust for the times, like I said a second ago. And you end up sort of leaving behind any kind of ideology. And what's left really is just power for power's sake. Fascism becomes stripped of its philosophical underpinnings and simply becomes a mechanism for social and political control that is justified by the exercise of power. So if there is anything that fascism ultimately is committed to, it is the idea that you do whatever it takes to gain and to maintain power. And if that means abandoning your principles, that means abandoning your principles. So the theorists that are attached to fascism either become disillusioned in some way and fall apart and no longer become fascists, or they ignore the contradictions or they try to rationalize the contradictions. And anyone who has not bought into the fascist ideology usually can see this for the patent excuse-making that it actually is. Okay, let's turn now to the titular 5 stages of fascism. Let's start by outlining all 5 of them, and then we will take a slow walk through each of them. The first stage is the initial creation stage, or the proto-fascism stage. This is when you have small groups getting together and starting to talk about them, hooligans on the street, if you will, getting together and starting to form early-stage political parties. 2 is the rooting in the political parties. This is when those street gangs start to actually start to form a platform. They start to make connections to the existing political establishments and oftentimes try to flex their muscle in a way that will get them more political traction and more political power. Then there's the actual acquisition of power when fascists are brought into holding offices of some kind. This may be in the military or it may be in civil or national political power. Then there's the exercise of power when they oftentimes is most notoriously an example of Adolf Hitler when he kicked away the existing political establishment and seized power and started using it for his own purposes, disregarding the existing political structures. And then the 5th and final stage is what Paxton calls either radicalization or entropy. This is a bifurcated stage. You go one of 2 directions. Hitler went one, Mussolini went the other. I'll explain all of these stages in more detail here in just a second. The key thing to note for now, though, is the recognition that a fascist movement can begin and then collapse before getting through all 5 stages. So Paxton is not saying that unless you make it through all 5 stages, you are not a fascist party. Or a fascist movement. Most fascist movements fail to make it all the way through. Again,
I watched a video you did where you're like, basically the Christian nationalists are going to get it all, and you're right. We are.
Yeah, but I just posted one. The 3 political vibe shifts that will be changing. Yes, the Christian nationalists are in the ascent, no doubt. And that's a direct result because of all the degeneracy and nonsense that came, a lot of it from the left. But it also comes from the right.
Centrist.
No.
Yeah, you're the biggest enablers. You're the enablers.
Wrong.
Yes. No, not wrong. You're the enablers.
The ultimate enemy of the enlightened centrist, besides the regular moderate centrist, is degeneracy itself.
1.3.5, the Alt Right Playbook. There's a great series from a channel called Innuendo Studios that's almost a decade old at this point called the Alt Right Playbook. Whilst this is not explicitly on fascism, I think that it contains several really important insights. In particular, I want to bring attention to mainstreaming, because I believe that this process of mainstreaming is what's being used by people like Andrew in order to try and shift and normalize dynamics in favour of reprehensible views that have been made taboo.
Folks, we're talking today about mainstreaming, the process by which a group or idea from the fringes of society moves towards the center, how strangers become neighbors, and how thoughts become common sense. There's this concept known as the Overton window, which I am not going to describe because plenty of people have done so already, link in the down there part. But in short, as a fringe group becomes more visible and their language becomes more commonplace, their presence in society starts to seem normal. They become demystified. Some people who thought they were strange and threatening will start to warm up to them, though this doesn't happen across the board. Many who hated them when they were fringe will see their becoming mainstream as a kind of... This is a battle over the definition of normal. The alt-right knows how plastic culture can be. Their anger comes from the normalization of things they hate, and their movement exists because they believe anything that becomes mainstream can be made fringe again, which is why if you want to cater to them, you promise to reassert old norms. Much as we'd like to believe that people are driven by morality, most people are driven by the desire to be normal.
Okay, so here's the thing that's so funny about this, right? It's like, ultimately, when we say retarded, yeah. So I wouldn't use the N-word. Here's why. When I say that, if somebody says the N-word, what ends up ultimately happening, there's not really too much in the way of equivocation there. Retard is not actually referring to retarded people, though. Basically, ever. Nobody ever says it, Parker, to refer to somebody who's actually retarded.
That doesn't change it. Hold up. If you're using the N-word to refer to a white person, it's still wrong. Would you use the N-word to refer to a white person?
I mean, in some circumstances, I think that you can use it in a comedic sense. That's hilarious. Sure.
You think white people using the N-word is okay in any circumstance?
Yeah, comedic senses especially. I think it's fine.
Agree. Does every single time you have sex with a woman require consent?
Well, I would say sex implicitly, by definition, would be consensual. If it's not, then it's rape.
So then every instance of sex would require consent?
Correct.
Okay. So if a husband wakes up in the morning and he has a... And I enjoy it. I enjoy raping her. I enjoy it.
Having sex with someone unconscious?
My wife, yeah. Yeah, I like it waking her up that way.
But you said if she didn't wake up, you would stop.
I know she does sometimes. She's like,
I don't.
She's like, And I'm like, yeah, that's right. And she's like, okay. I know, yeah. She's like she can't believe this is happening. I've really shocked her. And then she just she's okay with it. Is that wild? Am I graping her?
I think without having some form of express consent, then yeah.
Yeah. Damn, I do this all the time. Constantly.
Constantly?
I really do. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Constantly is crazy.
Yeah. Anytime I wake up with a boner, if she's not awake, she's definitely getting woke up that way.
Well, why? I'm curious. Why don't you just wake her up?
I am waking her up with my penis.
I'm asking before. I'm asking what is the...
1.4.0 Andrew Wilson's fascism. So is Andrew Wilson a fascist? Yes. He meets all of Jason Stanley's criteria. He is actively engaged in and advocating for stages 3 and 4 of Paxton's stages of fascism. He is not merely someone with racial hang-ups, misogynistic views, or an authoritarian tendency. He actively wants to reshape world history, and to do so through the purification of the nation using his fundamentalist theological ideas. He wants the individual to be subjugated to the power of the state, where that power is controlled in alignment with his fascistic values. As I've demonstrated the criteria for fascism through these various ways, I've presented all of the clips that establish that Wilson meets these criteria throughout this video. The problem with all of this is that there's never going to be any smoking gun. This is why when I talked to Wilson, I tried to ask him how he would go about demonstrating Mussolini was a fascist to someone who didn't believe him. What would a demonstration even look like? Skepticism can always be applied, and legitimate skepticism has a place, particularly where a term is prone to abuse. But skepticism can also be strategic. Someone can always ask a further request for a justification. Do you just point to his outfit and silly boots? So here's a good question is, what would have to change about Wilson's views for me to think he wasn't fascistic? Firstly, there's the way that he wants to seize power through institutions. I think that most normal democratic viewpoints are that the institutions are supposed to be independent and strong in various ways, and they're supposed to represent a pluralistic society, not to be one homogeneous thing. I think there are various essentializing and hierarchical aspects of Wilson's views, which, if they changed, would persuade me that he was leaning away from fascism. I think that there's a myth about the purification of the nation, and certainly this language of the nation is a very strange way of viewing things. I think that if Wilson moved away from this, again, I would be more prone to think he wasn't a fascist. Similarly, if Wilson's values advocated for any internationalist movements, then that would raise some questions for me about how I want to characterise his politics. But as things stand, I think it's pretty clear that Wilson is a fascist. The other aspects of Wilson's views that stick out to me are the constant grievance mongering, the victimhood narratives. These take many forms, and they're almost always conspiratorial, vague, and amorphous. Wilson is being persecuted by all the women of the world who have some kind of conspiracy against him. and that conspiracy involves them leaving their natural hierarchical place in the world, which is beneath men like him. He believes in these things like colour revolutions, and that Marxists have infiltrated America. Rather ironically, he seems to take none of the caution in characterising Marxism that he demands that people take when characterising his views as fascist. He's very open about being a Christian nationalist. He tries to mainstream and normalise homophobia and sexism. And I think one of the most important points here is that Wilson only really believes in power and dominance, and that is particularly true of his audience too. All of this, again, is really weird and fascist. On point 5.0, Objections. Okay, so these objections aren't going to be exhaustive, but these are some of the main ones I've either got or came up with. 1.5.1, I can't be fascist because I believe in the Constitution. One characteristic of contemporary fascism in an American context is often the ways that it stresses and strains the constitutional democracy that exists in the US. Now, some people who advocate for political movements that I or others would accuse of being fascist have attempted to defend their views by saying that the authoritarian strongman who they support is operating within the law. As such, they're not doing anything unconstitutional. There are many problems with this. One of the problems is to do with the way that the Constitution works. There are many unprecedented cases where a legal precedent hasn't been set because these constitutional crises have not occurred before in the past. In these cases, institutions like courts are forced to interpret the law in a way that they've not previously done before. The problem with this is that the individuals who comprise these institutions and are interpreting the law have been put in place and influenced by the contemporary political state. That is to say, they may be reacting to fear and threats, fear of being arrested, or they're fully on board with the party's goals in the first place. Now, it's not as simple as it just being that bad. The situation is a little bit more complicated than that. But this is fundamentally the problem, is that legally interpreting what the Constitution says is consistent with a whole range of different positions. And some of those positions are fascist. Something to note here is both Mussolini's fascist party and Hitler's National Socialists rose to power legally through elections and within the constraints of what their respective government systems allowed. So I think the idea that movements as harmful as Hitler's or Mussolini's would simply announce themselves by saying, look, I'm an enemy of the nation, are simply wrong. Rather, what happens in these cases is that these people attempt to mutate and modify what it means to be a member of the nation, and they try to take over the institutions so they can manipulate them and to seize hold on power in any way they can, because at the end of the day, all they believe in or care about is power.
So how have the fascist movements that have succeeded managed to succeed, if not through coups? Well, they succeed by gaining some political power, gaining a foothold, and then subverting the existing structures. It's a corruption from within kind of situation. And again, it works by making common cause with conservatives. Conservatives give them power in an effort to protect and restore the nation. And this happened in parallel in two circumstances. King Emmanuel in Italy thought that he could control Mussolini. He saw Mussolini had lots of followers, lots of people who liked him, so he thought, you know what, if I make allies with Mussolini, then Mussolini's support will become my support. And that did not happen. Mussolini came to power, and then he ended up basically displacing the king. The king never was officially dethroned, but he lost all effective political power. He became just a figurehead, and it was Mussolini who was in charge of the country for almost 2 decades. Same thing in Germany. President von Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor under the illusion that he would be able to control Hitler. That by giving Hitler power, a modicum of power, Hitler would be thankful to Hindenburg and would then work with him in order to push back socialist movements. And again, if you know your history, you know it didn't work out too well. Hitler ended up taking absolute power away from Hindenburg and away from all of the existing political establishments.
That they could, repeal the 19th, like they did maybe for abortion, right?
Right. So, I actually was surprised that happened. I didn't think it never happened.
Everybody was surprised it happened, but like I said, it can happen very rapidly. It's like, let's not pretend that this is not viable. Right? It's just that we get to pervert the system back, right? We get to do it back to them, the same thing they did to us.
So handling and interpreting the Constitution in a particular kind of way is no guarantee that someone isn't a fascist. The question that you have to ask is is the way that someone is interpreting the Constitution consistent with images from Kristallnacht or of the operations of the brown shirts in 1930s Germany? 1.5.2. You should only use fascism in its historic sense. I'll keep this short as I think I've responded to this same objection in a number of different forms. Whilst fascism has its origins in an historic movement, I think that many of the features of that movement are highly dependent on the context of Italian sociology and economics at the time in which that political movement arose. I think that the salient features that make that political movement and adjacent political movements at the time so harmful can and have been successfully recognised. And I think that the purpose of studying such movements in history is not for the sort of intrinsic pleasure that one might gain from knowledge, but in order to try to protect our societies from making the same mistakes that they did in the past. As such, I think we should retain the word fascism with a legitimate political use, one where the invocation of the word is not done lightly, but where the word exists as a kind of last stand for democracy, a call to people who are inculcated and educated within a society to understand the evils that happened historically and to share the values of democracy, to realise that something politically is really amiss and that they need to be active in shaping and protecting democracy today. 1.5.3. The pendulum swings. The pendulum swings. There's this metaphor in politics that the pendulum swings, it goes between right and left. There are a number of reasons that I think this is wrong. One of them is that I don't think that there are natural laws that govern politics. And even if there were some things like natural laws, I don't think they would be so simplistic that they could be accurately modelled by a pendulum. I don't think that there is a unidimensional scale which accurately measures political disagreements and along which a pendulum could swing. If you wanted to quantify or operationalize political values, then you would end up with a many-dimensional graph, and you would not find that political movements had static positions on that graph over time. So I think the metaphor here is partly a kind of thought-terminating cliche that's just mistaken. However, without challenging the assumptions that go into making the claim, if I were to take it seriously, I would think that this is not an ordinary swing of the pendulum. I would think that what we're observing in our contemporary politics is the pendulum swinging to a point where we see the tether fraying and the fulcrum coming loose from the wall. If we're using artistic metaphors, then I get to paint a picture too. The reason that I think this is because of the challenges to constitutional democracy in the US and challenges to the international order globally. Trump's ambivalence towards European defence interests and NATO signals an unprecedented change in global power since the Second World War. His cozying up to Putin signals a bizarre shift in values and indicates his desire to be treated as a strongman leader with his own sphere of influence in the same vein as Putin and Xi Jinping. We can see challenges to the education system, the university system. We have seen unprecedented incompetence and unprofessionalism, handling international diplomacy involving nuclear weapons through insane, rambling tweets. We've seen a premeditated plot to undermine a democratic election, and a violent protest or riot that could be considered an insurrectionist coup attempt, where many members were parts of trained militias and had weapons stores nearby, ready for an armed firefight. We have seen these people after they were charged, pardoned by a president coming into power. This is absolutely unprecedented. We have seen the willing use of federal military troops against US citizens in local law enforcement against the wishes of local governors. Whilst this is not unprecedented, it is a sign incredibly early in Trump's second term, and it demonstrates a shift away from norms that had been established since 1965. The question you have to ask yourself is, would any other president have done this, even if you switched the values of the protesters but still had them burning Waymo cars? For example, would Barack Obama have done something like this? Or would he have escalated through the relevant normal avenues, including local law enforcement who claim that they have the problem under control? It gets even more worrying when you put this sort of thing in its context. This is clearly a sign that resistance to the federal regime will be met with the deployment and use of troops on home soil. We've seen unprecedented levels of corruption in the form of bribes, a completely worrying mingling of interest between corporate billionaires with wealth that no human on earth has ever had and the powers of the state. We've seen these millionaires celebrate having bought elections in certain states. We've seen them view themselves as kings, able to at their own will interfere in international geopolitics. We've seen clear and flagrant conflicts of interest, and we've seen them showing a complete lack of regard for the privacy of the data of ordinary citizens. I mean, really, I'm not even getting into everything, and that's just really because this is already a very long video, and I could keep going and producing evidence and going on and on and on, but what we are witnessing is absolutely unprecedented. Again, it's not that any one of these, I mean, some of these things individually are unprecedented, but all of them taken together is absolutely insane. So what I mean by this is that this is not just a normal example of the pendulum swinging. It's not even clear if the pendulum will swing back. For example, some people who don't understand the ways that the world has changed are still assuming that Trump will be out of office as he can't run for a third term. I would advise such people to watch the sequential clips from January the 6th to see what the Trump administration thinks around such formalisms as how many terms a president can or cannot serve. I think our best hope is Father Time, but my worry is that this administration has attracted so many unpleasant and frankly evil people that a power vacuum created by a loss of Trump at this point would potentially hardly be any better, and the deep fracturing in American society wouldn't heal itself overnight by his passing away. 1.5.4. Rather than fascist, you should say illiberal, populist, or demagogue. There are many terms that I would say are no less conceptually problematic than fascism, but that are certainly less controversial and so stir up less controversy when invoked. Some people make the case that rather than using words such as fascism, we should instead be using these less severe words. They're saying this to, I guess, people like me who are using words like fascism for certain political... The best articulation of this objection that I've come across was put by Roger Griffin, a historian who studies fascism, when he was speaking to Dan Snow on his History Hit podcast.
I feel the term welling up in me in various confrontations with bureaucracy.
Oh, God, I thought you were about to say now, Roger. You feel it welling up in you.
It makes me laugh because I can still feel myself. I mean, it gets to a point where I sort of double think about it, but it's still there as a colloquialism to use. But I've built my career on trying to sharpen up its usage in academic context so that we don't just fling it around for any form of authoritarianism or populism.
We have got democratic backsliding. Modi, Orban, Putin's, Trump. In that context, how should we feel about the use of that word? It's a powerful word. Does it alert people? Or is it losing its any kind of power because of its reproduction?
It's become a semantically blunt word. It's a blunt tool to express negative emotions.
So the first thing I'm going to comment on is this. Has he done any empirical inquiry in order to establish that? Of course, I think it's the case that some people are overusing the word. But it doesn't follow from the fact that some people overextend the use of the word or abuse it, that all people are doing so. And I think that making the jump from some observations of people overextending the word to saying that nobody is permitted to use it in a contemporary context only functions to serve people with extremely harmful political views that ought to be characterized.
If we get into its use in human sciences, we have to be careful. If people don't quite know what a virus is and they call everything a virus and it's not technically a virus, it doesn't really matter outside, but it does matter if it's your GP.
Now here he tries to draw an analogy between the abuse of this term and the abuse of a term in the medical sciences. Now in the analog case, I definitely agree that I don't want doctors to be abusing the term virus and then doing all sorts of random medical experiments with me as a result of that. The question is the analogy tight enough? In what ways does the word fascism function, and how does the functioning of the word within academic political science connect to any practices or activity in the same way that medicine connects to activities and practices of treating people? I can't see a close enough link between the two cases in order to see how that analogue fits the case of people characterising fascism in a way where contemporary political movements would satisfy it.
Because if you get headlines in quality newspapers saying fascism is on the rise, you want to know what's on the rise. And if it's just being used as a loose term for right-wing behavior or racism or loss of liberal values, and that is a very different statement from a statement that evokes memories of the interwar period and the rise of Nazism.
Again, I basically agree with his concern here. I also want to be able to understand what headlines are saying. I don't want the term to be completely meaningless, and I don't think people should use it in a completely loose way. But as a reaction to that, I also don't think that people should constrain it in an overly restrictive way. Now, if some newspapers decide to publish headlines that include the word fascism, and the word fascism is used in an inappropriate way, does that mean no one ever gets to use it? I don't think so. All that would mean, to me, is that that newspaper headline was a bad headline. Now, should concerns about fascism be raised when we see racist, sexist, or authoritarian politics cropping up? I think the answer to this is more ambiguous. I don't think any of those things are sufficient conditions for something to be fascism. However, I certainly think that they can be red flags, and that a case can be established with caution that some amount of various criteria are met, and that things look worrying. The last thing that I want to note is that he mentions evoking memories of the interwar period, and I think that this is the absolute crux of the issue. The question is, are we encountering politics that we find so dangerous and bad and threatening that we should be evoking those memories of that period from our history that shaped and changed the world for the past 100 years? And I don't think that there is any scientific way to answer that question. Of course, there are epistemic parts of that. We don't want to form false beliefs about what's going on by falling foul of misinformation or disinformation. But supposing we do know what's going on, then our evaluation of whether what's going on politically is as bad or as much of a threat as what happened prior to World War II in Italy or Germany, well, I think that that evaluation is going to be based upon whatever our political and moral values are. And honestly, looking at the sort of claims that someone like Wilson is making, and looking at some of the things that are happening in America, I don't think people should be loosely applying the word to everything, but I actually don't think it's off the table. Some of the things being proposed are incredibly worrying, and I don't think the fact that many of these people don't share the exact same views as 20th century Italians or wear leather boots is really good enough to motivate me not to use the word.
Do you share the concern that in India, in Indonesia, in Hungary, in the US, in parts of Europe, there has been threats to liberal democracy? And have we got another adjective we can use?
Oh, absolutely. We've got a lot of adjectives. I mean, it's a bit like if you say a Portuguese man of war is a jellyfish and you get stung by one, it doesn't really matter that it's not technically a jellyfish. It does if your life is to do with preserving jellyfish. I mean, it's really worth looking up, but they're not jellyfish.
I would modify the jellyfish metaphor in a similar way. Did our person who is trying to preserve jellyfish get into preserving jellyfish just because they really value the activity of trying to preserve jellyfish in and of itself? Or did they have some broader concern for preserving and conserving marine life that led to them specialising in jellyfish, but their concern actually encompasses all natural things in the ocean? As such, compared and contrasted to the person who is obsessed with intrinsic jellyfishness, who allows Portuguese men of war to go extinct, the person who interrogates what their deeper values were realises that even though Portuguese men of war are not technically jellyfish, if they've come across some findings in the field that relate to the ecosystem within which jellyfish and Portuguese men of war live, and the Portuguese men of war will go extinct if some course of action is not taken, then their deeper values, the ones that guided them into getting into jellyfish in the first place, will determine that they raise those concerns and use their expertise of marine life in order to do so. The way in which I think that this is analogous to the fascism case is because I think that some academics are overly focused on an out-of-touch ivory tower dispute, and they have to ask themselves the question of why did they get into political science or history in the first place? If their interest in studying historic fascism was in order to prevent us repeating history again, I would suggest that maybe they've become so focused on particular and essentializing aspects of the history here that they've actually got in their own way with respect to being effective public communicators who can help the public to understand the dangers of what's going on.
The reason why we need a conceptual toolkit is because if we lump them all together and then call them fascists, then if we're trying to combat them, then we might be reacting inappropriately to them because there are different ways of fending off the danger they.
So again, in principle here, I agree with what he has to say. However, I just don't think he's specific enough. He sort of hints at the idea that he has these analyses that are connected to better practical interventions for achieving political aims that fend off harmful political views. But I just don't understand what those actually are. In our current political climate, where the international order is declining, we're on the brink of a new war in the Middle East, potentially involving nuclear weapons. where military threats have been sent to century-old allies, with prospects of invasion, where people are being detained without due process, where the world's longest-standing democratic project is being threatened by the reigning political party ignoring rulings of the highest court in the land, and where the public is incredibly divided and heated on a whole range of topics. I think the question is, if you have these tools that are so effective, what are they, and why aren't you using them, and why aren't they working? Now that's not to say you should just turn around, right, and start labelling everything fascist as well. But maybe you should start considering where those red lines are for you. Again, to bring it back to the historic memory, how bad would things have to get, and how similar would they have to be to that interwar period in order for you to think it was appropriate to say that history may not be repeating itself, but was certainly rhyming? I think Jason Stanley put this well in a recent interview.
Last decade had kind of what we call the fascism debate, where people were like, is this just authoritarianism or is it fascism? And in a way, my own view now is we need to get away. There's a total waste of time, because it's very clear that what we're seeing is dangerous far-right authoritarianism, and no one should care at all what you call it. But labels like right-wing authoritarianism or labels like populism, right-wing populism, are really bad because they don't convey the threat. They're ways of whitewashing the threat. What we have is a far-right authoritarianism. I've argued in detail in my book that it fits the label of fascism, but I really think it's a distraction right now.
1.5.5. Your criteria are too permissive or vague. If the criteria on offer are too permissive or too vague, then maybe they're inappropriate to be used. I suspect that this objection stems from an unrealistic demand for an essentializing definition that covers all cases and provides necessary and sufficient conditions. At the start of this video, I talked about why I reject these views. Whilst I think that fascism is a highly polysemous concept and a difficult one, I don't think that does anything to undermine its legitimacy as a political term. In fact, I think almost all useful political concepts are like this to some degree. For example, if you consider the word conservative. In the UK context, conservatives are often to the left of Democrats in the US context. In the UK context, conservatism covers various positions. There is a view in the Conservative Party that is incredibly libertarian in terms of its policy outlook. There is also a tradition called One Nation conservatism, which might look to some people an awful lot like socialism. This is because it places an emphasis on obligations and duties that the rich have to the poor in order to create material conditions that support the flourishing of the citizenry. Now, the US context is incredibly different to this. Within the US context, conservatism now means something more like the MAGA movement, with Republicans who aren't on board with the MAGA movement being coined rhinos, Republicans in name only. This MAGA conservatism is in stark opposition, in fact, to ways that American conservatism has been historically conceived. For example, Ronald Reagan's conservatism, whilst not exactly like the conservatism of someone like Gladstone or the One Nation conservatives, certainly viewed itself as having certain types of moral obligations and duties, in particular duties of the US as the most powerful nation in the world to uphold world peace and promote democracy, and also to oppose Russian authoritarianism. Perhaps you can immediately see how this is in stark contrast to the isolationism and autarky of MAGA conservatism, and there may even have been a theological justification for some of these views. Similarly, we can look at words like liberal. Liberalism has some more precise senses which are connected to historic origins stemming from the Enlightenment. In contemporary US discourses, liberal also has a legitimate use, but that use takes on a different cluster of features to historic liberalism, as understood by Enlightenment thinkers, and to this day in a British political context. And then we can look in the past 10 years.
Our core classical liberal beliefs of our Western liberal cultural heritage.
Have you ever described yourself with the term classical liberal?
Oh, absolutely.
So you use that term?
Yeah, it's the intellectual tradition that I come from.
But classical liberalism is essentially libertarianism, though, in terms of economic policy.
Is this something atypical for classical liberals? Do you think that you were able to wake up classical liberals and realize that they've kind of been fighting for things that are illiberal?
That's a very good question. So I think there are two parts there. Something that I'm trying to figure out myself that I can't understand. Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, why is it that some people never fell for this stuff?
Our education system into social justice factories where grievance and division are the only outputs.
I mean, I guess in so many ways, you could have stayed there and said, let me try to save it. But
No.
you realize there's no saving to be
No,
done.
I want the whole system to be burned to the ground.
Trading on a difference between the contemporary usage of the word liberal and historic liberalism, some people came along and called themselves classical liberals. Now, what's interesting about these classical liberals is that very frequently they were funded by political actors such as Viktor Orban, who outright claimed to be illiberal. At the 29th Balvanos Summit Open University and Student Camp, he gave a speech wherein he said, "Liberal democracy is liberal, while Christian democracy is, by definition, not liberal. It is, if you like, illiberal. And we can specifically say this in connection with a few important issues, say 3 great issues. Liberal democracy is in favour of multiculturalism, while Christian democracy gives priority to Christian culture. This is an illiberal concept. Liberal democracy is pro-immigration, while Christian democracy is anti-immigration. This is again a genuinely illiberal concept, and liberal democracy sides with adaptable family models, while Christian democracy rests on the foundations of the Christian family model. Once more, this is an illiberal concept." Now, in that speech, Viktor Orban is endorsing and advocating for his illiberal model of government.
I would say right now, I mean, Hungary is in and you were one of the first guys in my world really saying, Dave, go visit Hungary and see what that model is like and see how, ironically, the conservatives are defending liberalism better than the liberals will defend it themselves. So I had a wonderful time there, and I spent some time with Viktor Orban, who is thought of as this, the media tells you he's this fascist right-wing lunatic. I spent about half hour with him at the prime minister's palace. And all he talked about was, hey, I just love my country. We just want to maintain our culture. We want to respect minorities, blah, blah, blah.
And whilst perhaps on the surface, talking about things such as the marketplace of ideas, these people have expressed a politically authoritarian bent, having no problem with state intervention in the university system, suppressing ideas that they disagree with, and the use of state force when it comes to oppressing people groups that they dislike. Now, one way of dealing with the polysemy of liberal as a term would be to essentialize it given any one of these particular uses. However, I think this is a mistake. I think that the family resemblance view enables us to pay careful attention to history and the etymology of words. That is to say, we can look at the diachronic and synchronic meaning of words. Diachronic meaning through time, synchronic meaning at a particular point in time. In doing so, we can pick out relevant features and differences, and we can even have explanations for those differences that are grounded in historical events, economic forces, and philosophical ideas. I think that this is a much more realistic view of the way that these words and concepts actually operate, rather than committing ourselves to some kind of a priori essentialist definition and then fighting the vast majority of English language speakers who happen to disagree with our characterization. So I believe we can see how many indispensable and useful political terms are also difficult, polysemous, and require nuance and intellectual effort in order to understand the ways in which they're being used and how we should characterize them. Whilst there is some content to the label fascism, it also obviously has some strong pejorative force. Now, the charge of permissiveness is maybe a worry that the word has simply taken on this role of being a kind of political slur that has no meaning to it. Now, if people genuinely believe that, I actually don't know what they're getting so riled up about or why they care so much about these accusations of fascism. That is to say, if you genuinely think it's meaningless or simply just a slur, why would you not just ignore it? However, I just don't think it's right that it's too amorphous. I think that there are principled characterizations that can be given, but establishing any particular case of fascism is going to be complicated because it is a complicated concept. I cover this in more detail in section 1.5.8. So I want to highlight a couple of things that are going on here. I think that there is some legitimate concern about overextension of the word and people having ambiguous characterizations. What I think is an overstatement is to say that that sort of problem is endemic and that nobody is responsibly using the word, and nobody can, in principle, responsibly use the word, even if they can't offer an essentializing characterization. 1.5.6 Soy Gay Autism Lisp. Haha, but I can smell your fear, you gay, autistic, lispy, low testosterone soy boy. Whilst harping on about objective truth and how everyone who they disagree with is a postmodern Marxist who doesn't believe in objective truth and so can't believe things or something, people who exhibit the kind of traits of fascist politics that I've been talking about in this video often demonstrate none of the virtues with rational intellectual inquiry which you would expect from people who have well-informed views on these topics. Often, when push comes to shove, these people degenerate into providing a series of completely irrelevant ad hominem insults that have absolutely nothing to do with my views or arguments relating to fascism or its political legitimacy. I have received many of these insults from Andrew Wilson fans since engaging with him. I suspect that a large majority of those actually come from bots, though there are of course people in his audience who think like this too.
For like more than an hour now, and it all just comes out, like all of his trauma just comes out now from this debate, and all of the dicks that he sucked just comes.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm super confused here.
It's alright, I can help.
Do you suck?
My aim is to help.
Do you suck men's dicks?
Only your dad's.
Yeah, so you do. So I mean, that's gay, bro. I have a source for that if you would like it. It's from the NIS. And
you got to open it.
Oh, I have to open it right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It's easier because it's an olive jar, though. Wait, put it.
My nail is fucking me up.
Yes, I do have a source for that if you would like it. It's from the NIS. Anybody can find it. I just cited all of the statistics on it yesterday. Uh-oh. Come on, you can do it.
Put it right side up. Just
You can
so
do
doesn't
it. You
spill
got
on you.
this.
All right, bro. I can't do it. Here.
All right. Oh my god. I guess, yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
I'm supposed to open the pickle jar?
It's like a, yeah.
Oh, jeez.
This seems a little immature. No. For $1,000.
Hey, the guy sent $1,000.
Yeah, but it seems slightly immature.
It's all fucking
it's just
slick
for-
now.
it's a little-
See, it little fun. Is.
I gotta grip it.
Uh-oh, Andrew. If you can't open it either.
Well, your hand greased the whole top of it.
My hand are fine. Here, high five.
It
My
literally.
shoes are fine as well.
It's look, feel it. Isn't that greasy?
It was like that already. Oh my god.
No,
you're
it
ridiculous.
wasn't. You greased the top.
Use
Oh
your
my
shirt.
Jesus,
Use your
Andrew.
shirt,
If you can't open the olive jar, you cannot
Here,
blame my
while
hand.
we're doing olive jar.
If you're so strong, you should open it.
Yeah, I got to be able to grip it.
Okay, we'll grip it. Let's
It's
go.
literally slippery.
Back.
Grab me a paper towel so I can dry the top of it off.
Okay, once the top is dry, if you still
But do
can't
we
get it
now
out.
need to allow her another opportunity with the?
Yeah, give her the paper towel so
Give her
that.
the
No,
paper
I think
towel.
you should do it, Andrew. You're the big, strong man. There you go. Come on.
Here, I'm gonna let some chats come
Ungreased.
through. We got some
Red
chats
Fox
while they're working on that.
donated
Red
$200.
Fox, thank you.
Deontology prioritizes intent, but threshold
I also want to say that watching Picklegate genuinely makes me feel sorry for Andrew and people like him who are attracted to his points of view. I genuinely view their abhorrent views as a kind of projection of a deep sense of masculine insecurity that they feel. And I think that as a result of that insecurity, people like Andrew gain a great sense of validation and power from beating up on these OnlyFans women and in promoting this harsh, brutalist and masculine sounding point of view. The problem is that where the rubber meets the road, as soon as someone like Andrew is asked to perform a task like open a pickle jar, you see this sort of look of horror across his face. And I can imagine those feelings that he may have had as a young boy of being very small, insecure, and worthless, coming up again as he panics about his ability to open this pickle jar and perform his masculine role. And there's just something about this that, I don't know, it's not just that it's kind of like humiliating, but it genuinely makes me feel sorry for the guy. And I can also imagine the sorts of people who are at home watching him being in a similar sort of position of feeling really insecure, and that being what's appealing to them about the sorts of views that Andrew's putting forward and seeing him dunk on people. And I think that that's also a part of this whole rhetoric around trying to abuse everyone who disagrees and simply calling them, gay, autistic, soy boy, lispy people.
I notice you do this. You try to troll, but you're bad at it.
Okay.
So just answer the question. You also suck dick. Like, you can't beat me on that front, bro. You suck dick.
I can't beat you at sucking dick.
Yeah, you can't beat me on the troll front. You suck dick, bro. Like,
I think it's also worth me saying that I recognized this in my initial interaction with Andrew, and I did try to play into this too much and potentially preemptively. And I do regret that. I think that it was a mistake and it was too combative, and I should have initially extended more grace to Andrew and been more nice to him to try and make him feel safe and secure so he could have a productive conversation. Now, for people who think that there's something insightful or intelligent about these sort of responses...
Also suck dick. Like, you can't beat me on that front, bro.
I have two questions for you. First, can you describe what you see in this image? Second, can you describe your mother using only single words? Now, my suspicion is that these people don't really care about a video like this. They don't really care about engaging with my analysis or thinking about it in any kind of difficult way. I think that they probably don't have sophisticated political or philosophical views on just about anything. And that for them, as with historic fascists, things like reasoned discourse and debate online are merely tools that they can use in order to seize power and to mainstream and normalize the sorts of views that they hold. I should still point out that these sorts of insults have absolutely no relevance, connection, or bearing to my analysis of what fascism is, or my analysis of whether anyone meets criteria that I've given for being fascist politically. Additionally, I think that this highlights something about fascist politics and the way that it's all really just about power. Jean-Paul Sartre, in the aftermath of World War II in France, talks about his experience with the Nazis and their engagement with the so-called Jewish question. He says, "Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for, by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that the time for argument is past." And whilst contemporary political movements are not as explicitly anti-Semitic as, for example, the fascist movement in Nazi Germany was in the 1930s and 40s, this theme of playing with the discourse, of not caring about using words responsibly, and the kind of intellectual pageantry of pretending to care about things such as truth and reasoned discourse, but really it all just being a display of dominance and an attempt to subdue and maybe humiliate the person that you're engaging with, is a feature that I think persists between contemporary forms of fascism and historic. 1.5.7 Appeal to Authority Fallacy. Now, I got one comment that involved an objection to what I had to say about fascism, which was that because I was referencing these academics' works in my characterization of fascism, that I was engaging in an appeal to authority fallacy. Now, I think that this person probably just doesn't understand informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are not fallacies that guarantee that something is wrong, and there's in fact some cases where the features of an informal fallacy will be present in a good argument. Appeals to authority are fallacies of relevance. That is to say, the authority of some person in some respect is being appealed to where that authority does not have relevance to the topic under discussion. So, for example, suppose that I disagree with my girlfriend about whether or not Lilo and Stitch is a good film. She can say, "I'm a doctor, therefore I'm right because you're not a doctor." And her authority in this case is completely irrelevant to her evaluation of whether or not Lilo and Stitch is a good movie. Now, suppose that my girlfriend and I disagree about some medical condition that I have. She's going to say, "Seriously, listen to me, I'm a doctor." And I'm going to say, "Nah bro, trust me, I googled it." Now, in that case, this appeal to authority is perfectly relevant and in fact a good feature of an argument, because her expertise and authority as a doctor is perfectly relevant to the topic of discussion. So even if my argument did rest upon appealing to the credentials of the various authors whose works I have been referencing in this video, my appeal to their authority would not necessarily be fallacious, just in case they're relevant experts on the topic under discussion, namely fascism. However, I'm not depending upon the status or authority of these people in order to make their views correct. I'm actually just referencing them because I think it's good practice. It enables people points to touch off if they want to search further papers or books or talks and investigate these topics themselves. I think that the characterizations that these people give have their various merits and drawbacks, which I've talked about in this video. And so whichever way you look at it, if I am appealing to the authority of these people, then their authority is perfectly relevant, and that's fine. And if I'm not appealing to the authority of these people, which I claim I'm not, then the accusation that I'm committing an appeal to authority fallacy completely misses the mark. So whether I am or not appealing to the authority of these people, my arguments will still stand. 1.5.8. So everything you disagree with is fascist? In the gumming up the work section, I mentioned a kind of rhetorical strategy that people can engage in around definition mongering and creating unreasonable burdens that definitions would have to meet in order to control and manipulate a debate. Another semantic game or objection that people will participate in order to gum up the works, is to argue that the person who is using the word fascism is doing something infelicitous. They're simply using the word to apply it to anything that they disagree with whatsoever. The idea here is to discredit the person who is using the word fascism to render their accusations of some politics being fascist as completely irrelevant or contentless. Now, my first response to this is to say that I just think this is obviously not what I'm doing. I've put an awful lot of work here into going through historic fascism, various academic characterizations of fascism, and objections from academics who hold different views to me, justifying why I disagree with them. I don't think I'm simply using the word for anything that I disagree with. I think I'm using it in a principled way, according to a characterization that I've given that makes sense and I think fits history, reason, and experience. However, to demonstrate that not everything that I disagree with, or even strongly politically disagree with and condemn, is fascist according to me, I thought I would go through a few examples of things that I disagree with politically that I do not consider fascist. In UK politics, recently North Cornwall MP Ben Maguire claimed that J.K. Rowling's politics were fascist in a spat on Twitter over trans rights. In the dispute, he said, "I don't block anyone, I'm a liberal Democrat. Such a shame you feel you must shut down anyone that might slightly disagrees with you. I've spent my life defending women's rights, most recently on the House of Commons, looking at violence against women and girls. Guessing that doesn't fit your fascist agenda though. I must be the enemy of the people. As I said in my speech, our public discourse now is black or white, right or wrong. What a sad indictment on humanity." So here, I actually agree with Ben Maguire's points in various respects. I think that J.K. Rowling's views on trans politics are incorrect. I think that J.K. Rowling engages in sectarian and harmful discourse around these issues, and that she has waged an ideological crusade using her money banks to pursue an agenda legally as well on these topics. I also understand why in a heated moment Ben would use this word, fascist, in order to express how frustrated and angry he is with Rowling's behaviour around this topic. However, this is a case of the use of the word fascist where I think it's just simply inappropriate. Rowling's views are simply not close enough to the types of characteristics that I've discussed in this video in order to be considered fascistic. For example, Rowling doesn't have any particular strong mythological history of the past that she wants to return to. Rowling doesn't have any particular view of the nation or of ethno-nationalism, the in-group or the out-group, though of course trans people are a particular type of out-group, whereby the nation or the in-group need to be reborn and cleansed or purified. I don't think that Rowling's views are particularly martial or militaristic in any kind of way, and I don't think that Rowling has any kind of overall political agenda or vision for politics. I don't think that Rowling's views are particularly hierarchical or authoritarian in the sense that she wants an individual strong man or woman type leader. And whilst the argument can be made that Rowling does meet these criteria to some extent, for example, she may paint a picture of Britain that looks at the past through rose-tinted glasses to a time when trans people were less visible, and while she may engage in some forms of propaganda, for example, contributing to media hype cycles spreading disinformation or misinformation around trans topics, I don't think that this is similar enough to the types of extreme information warfare and propaganda campaigns that we see coming out of, say, Hitler's Germany with Joseph Goebbels, Russia's information warfare in the West, involving paying these YouTubers and podcasters full time to promote particular points of view and to undermine alternative points of view, not just on principled grounds, but using psychological strategies for destabilizing people's conceptualization of truth and reality themselves. So I think Ben Maguire was wrong to call J.K. Rowling fascist. There are many more examples of political decisions and motifs that I strongly disagree with but would not consider to be fascist. One of them would be George Bush and Tony Blair's war in Iraq. This was also based on an us versus them narrative of a clash of civilizations between the Western world and the Middle East, comprised of Islamic terrorists. We also saw a kind of glorification of militarism and expansionist, globalist intervention in a way that shares some parallels with the expansionist aims of various fascist regimes. However, neither of these examples are sufficiently similar to the characterizations of fascism given to be considered fascistic, no matter how strongly we might disagree with them. Even though various terror acts proposed infringements on rights that had not previously been put in place legally in the US and in UK contexts, there was no fundamental challenge to the rule of law in the courts that existed. There was no challenge to the Constitution in the US or to existing institutions in the UK. There was no real storytelling of a mythic past that we were returning to by engaging in this war. In fact, I think in a UK context, we were incredibly aware and suspicious of our colonialist history and our engagement in another foreign war, given the harm that our past military interventions had caused and a kind of guilt as a result of that. There was no wide-scale propaganda or suppression of the press. Whilst journalists expressed political views from all sides of the aisle, there was certainly a consistent great level of scrutiny on military operations and how they were being conducted. And I should add, there are subsequent inquests and reports of war crimes that have come out since the termination of these wars. I don't mean that there weren't cover-ups or dodgy goings-on. What I mean is that journalists were interested in covering these things, and there was no risk of journalists going to prison for trying to hold up critical light to what might be going on. Academics and intellectuals were free in the universities to explore topics that related to the politics of the war and to be vehemently critical of it. As such, I don't think that Bush and Blair's war in Iraq can be considered fascistic. Another example of this would be the politics of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcherism destroyed UK domestic industrial capacity, ruined public infrastructure in many ways, and created a housing crisis that British people have to live with to this day. As disastrous as I think that those policies were, and as much as they relied on a kind of mythical version of the past, that was really myth upon myth. It was Thatcher's mythologization of Churchill's mythologization of Britain. I don't think that this constituted fascism. Sure, Thatcher wanted to change the soul of people in the nation. Though by this, I think that Thatcher means something quite thin and loose. She doesn't mean a kind of radical purification and rebirth, but really a slight change in mannerism and disposition. She wanted British attitudes to become more industrious and businesslike. She wanted people to aim upwards, which for her meant something like having lots of gumption. But Thatcher also didn't do this by suppressing journalism or by suppressing academics. Thatcher, in fact, wasn't particularly anti-intellectual, and whilst she took her lead from various intellectuals and academics such as Richard Dawkins, who I would strongly disagree with, she also deeply believed that what she was doing was right in order to encourage social mobility, and wanted to enable people from poorer backgrounds to receive the same sorts of education that people from more privileged backgrounds would receive. I simply think her policies were mistaken in this regard. Whilst Thatcher had traditional conservative views with respect to sexuality and relationships, She did not engage in stark demonization of people who engaged in sexual activities or relationship styles that she would disagree with. While she could be described as prudish, she did not have the same sort of sexual anxieties and moralizing that are characteristic of fascist movements and involve the demonization and persecution of people of these sexualities. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go on highlighting politics that I disagree with, but think are not fascist. But hopefully what you can also see is that there is this kind of demarcation issue with something like fascism. Fascism is not a scientific concept. It's not something that you can figure out through any kind of particular empirical test. There isn't a fascism detection machine that we can simply apply to politics to figure out whether or not something is fascist. There's a cluster of many criteria that combine in different sorts of ways, and even evaluating against each of these criteria is a qualitative assessment. There's some subjective judgment going on in terms of rating on a kind of scale of gradation how severe something is with respect to some kind of problematic quality. Still, I don't think that these problems of ambiguity and vagueness are insurmountable, and I don't think that they're sufficient to establish that the criteria are completely meaningless and can be applied to anything. The problem is that fascism is a complicated concept, and any intellectual disagreement over whether or not something is fascist or fascistic is going to involve careful analysis and discussion over what exactly is disputed. Now, part of the reason that this is a problem is because fascist politics is inimical to that type of inquiry and investigation. On the one hand, there is the academic context, but on the other hand, there is the real political context. And within that real political context, how does this word fascism operate? Well, I believe that the word fascism operates to invoke a historical memory, particularly amongst Europeans, but in Americans to a strong extent too. And that is a historic memory of some absolutely agreed upon evil political regime that we do not wish to return to. That is to say, if fascism is being invoked in politics, there is a real call to action to do something about it politically, and urgently so. So let's explore this in the next section. 1.5.9, Affirming the Consequent. Okay, so one objection that I got in a comment was that I'm committing the formal fallacy of affirming the consequent in my argument that people meet the criteria of fascism. This fallacy has the form if P then Q, Q therefore P. It is named what it is named because of the major conditional premise. Material conditionals in propositional logic have the following form. This is to say, this is supposed to be an interpretation of if P then Q. There are two well-formed formula either side of the conditional. The first is named the antecedent. The second is named the consequent. So here we have our argument affirming the consequent. You can see P then if P then Q, Q therefore P. I'm going to briefly explain why this is invalid. What we're concerned with in deductive logic is truth-preserving arguments. Truth-preserving arguments in deductive logic are ones where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In valid deductive arguments, under all interpretations where the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. We can construct a truth table in the following way. We have the atomic variables P and Q. We're using a bivalent logic system where we only assign to the variables the values true or false. This means there are only two possible values. The fact that there are only two possible truth values means that the number of possible combinations is going to be 2 to the number of primitive atomic variables that we have in our argument. That is to say, the atoms of our argument, our propositions, are the things that can be true or false, and so a truth table is supposed to be a picture of all the possible ways of combining values of truth and falsity. This is why we have 4 rows. So these 4 rows display all the possible combinations for the truth values of P and Q. We have interpretations where P and Q are both true, where P is false and Q is true, where P is true and Q is false, and where both are false. Now, what we're concerned with in using a truth table to assess the validity of an argument is analysing the rows in which all of the premises are true. I filled in the column for the truth table of a material conditional too. In the first and last columns of this truth table, we can find the rows where all of our premises are true. These are the first 2 rows where the conditional is true and the assertion of Q is also true. We don't have to concern ourselves with the other interpretations because at least one of the premises is false in those. Now, when we look at these interpretations where all of the premises are true, we can see the problem immediately. In the first row, the conclusion is true, but in the second row, the conclusion is false. This means that the truth of the premises is consistent with the truth and falsity of the conclusion, and so the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. We can compare and contrast this to modus ponens, which is a valid argument form. Here, highlighted in blue again, are the premises of the argument. And if we look for the rows where all of the premises are true, we find that only the first row contains an interpretation where all of the premises are true, and under that interpretation, the conclusion Q is also true. This means that the truth of the premises in an argument of this form guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So how does this relate to anything I've said? Well, the accusation goes something like this. The accusation is that I'm making the claim that if something is fascism, then it exhibits these characteristics that I've given it. These types of politics do exhibit these characteristics, therefore they're fascist. Now, I have given no such deductive argument, and in fact, I have rallied against such an interpretation consistently by maintaining that what I am offering are not necessary or jointly sufficient conditions. That has been a major part of what I have said over and over and over and over again. There are many ways you could construe what I'm doing, though to be honest, all of these formalisms seem sort of wrong. I mean, if it would be helpful, though I don't think it would, I could formalise what I'm doing as some kind of Bayesian argument or something. I think it's more honest to say that the type of fuzzy reasoning that's being deployed is something more like abductive reasoning. That is to say, a characterisation of a concept has been given, and then the case that I'm making is that evidence from the actions of certain politically active individuals or movements best fits with that characterisation of fascism rather than other political ideologies. However, even this seems slightly off. I think that what's going on is something more like prototypical reasoning or exemplar-based reasoning. This was a theory mentioned earlier in the section Gumming Up the Works. This is a psychological theory that suggests we categorise new instances comparing them to previously encountered individual exemplars that we have stored in our memory. This is a kind of pattern recognition. And actually, I think that the idea that this is pattern recognition has a lot of explanatory value. I think it explains how people can go off the rails using fascism in far too loose and permissive a way. You know, that would be something like seeing faces in the wall, or attributing agency to efficient causal processes, or explaining political grievances that have quite obvious sociological and economic explanations in terms of conspiratorial fantasies like colour revolutions, and by the agency of nefarious Marxists who have infiltrated all of society. This is all to say, though, I simply have not given a deductive argument, and I certainly haven't given a deductive argument in the form that affirms the consequent. I have rallied against this consistently, so please don't try to puff up your chest by invoking logical terms that you think are impressive, that from my point of view I came across many years ago in my education in philosophy and know far more about than you. That's not to say I can't be wrong, but some of these objections from Andrew Wilson fans are actually quite embarrassing, and they demonstrate the low level of intellectual inquiry that's endemic amongst Andrew and his audience. 1.6.0 What disagreements over fascism are really about.
So far, no.
He's a fucking fascist. I mean, he's like the fascist of fascists. I mean, you know, you got to have worked with the guy to understand how bad he is. Ask General Kelly. We got him on a show right now. He'd say the guy's a full-on fascist, loved Hitler. You know what Kelly told me? And he's probably going to be mad at me now because it's going to be public. He said to me...
Too late now.
He said to me, so he's praising Hitler's generals, and Hitler had these great generals. He goes, I was trying to tell him, they tried to, but they also tried to blow him up a few times.
Yeah.
They weren't that loyal to him. They were trying to blow him up once in a while, the Volkerei operation and so forth. But, Trump was obsessed with Adolf Hitler.
What's your definition of fascism, though? What's your definition of fascism as it relates to Trump?
The definition of fascism is that he would literally call a head of state and say, Alistair Campbell has said bad things about me. I want you to block his business from coming into your country. He has done that. That's fascism. Of course, that's fascism.
It's fascist behaviour.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, but lots of people who aren't fascists behave like that as well. So I think he's a.
You don't think he's a fascist?
No, I don't. I think because I would say fascism is a time-specific thing that comes about in the debris of the First World War, and I think there are some elements. There are lots of resonances. Don't get me wrong. There are lots of rhetorical similarities. Trump is a populist. He's a nationalist. He's a demagogue.
Do I have time to debate him or no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let me explain why he's not a fascist.
I got to turn.
He doesn't have a paramilitary force behind him. He doesn't have a cult of war. In fact, quite the opposite. Hitler, great example, trumpeted his service in the trenches. Trump avoided serving because of his draft offense, because of his spurs in his foot or whatever. Trump does not have a plan for aggressive expansion, as fascists so often do. But I think above all, fascism has a kind of an ideological dynamism, a momentum to remake society and to make new men in particular.
You don't think he has that?
And I don't think he has that because I don't think he has an
Do you think the people around him, do you think the Teals and the
Now, there may
Musks
be people
and the Project 2025
there may
people?
well be people who are attracted to a kind of fascism, but I don't think Trump. I think Trump himself is he's an egotist. He is a demagogue. He's a nationalist. He's not a fascist.
Dominic, he has said that he wants to use the American military against his citizens. He told Esper and Milley, shoot at the kneecaps of civilians in Lafayette Square.
Right, but lots of people do that and they're not fascists.
Okay, well, maybe we have a different definition, you and I, of fascism.
Okay.
How about people that say, let's take the FBI out of the Department of Justice and have them report directly to me as my Gestapo?
Well, again, I think you're talking about somebody
that's
who
not fascist?
He could be an authoritarian, he could be dictatorial, but is he a fascist? With a capital F? I don't think so.
But why do you say fascism is kind of is specific to one period of history?
The problem with you Brits is that you think that the word fascism is like too glib for your culture, okay? Because you experience fascism and the violence of the fascism, but we've never experienced it here in this country because of your favorite president, FDR. And this guy is a fascist, and this guy will do systemic damage to the system that has made this country the most prosperous and the greatest force. We got problems, we're not perfect, Vietnam, Iraq, etc. But the greatest force for peace in the history of man is a direct result of the decentralization of the power structure and the ability for blokes like me to move from penniless to where I am today. And you can't get there with authoritarians like Trump. He's a horrific human being. He's a total fascist. And you can think what you want, but I'm telling you, I work with the son of a bitch. And if we could get Kelly to dial in here right now, he'd be like, dude, Dominic, he's a fascist.
Say we want him to come on.
But I don't disagree with any of that. I don't disagree with any of that, but I'm saying that's not necessary. Being a terrible human being and being an authoritarian or being a nationalist does not make
me. If you're going to wreck the system of our government and take personal power in control. If you don't think that's the definition of fascism, that's fine. John Kelly and I think it is.
If we step back from the definitions, though, for a second, I think what we can agree on, says he trying to be smarmy here, right?
Yeah.
Is he is a massive threat to the largest and in many ways the greatest democratic experiment in the world. I mean, this is an incredible place that had universal suffrage before most of us, and he's threatening the Constitution. He's a threat to what kind of international order still remains. I mean, we're in a very, very difficult moment where the Israeli Prime Minister has just declared the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata, where Sudan is out of control, where we desperately need some sort of leadership, some kind of values. And so I think he's an affront, profound affront to everything that we really care about in terms of the economic future of the world, the democratic future of America, and international security. And it doesn't really matter whether he's a fascist.
I get reprimanded by Katty Kay on the show when I use the word fascist. She's like, you're being too glib.
I think he's a fascist.
We in Britain don't call these people fascists and so on and so forth. But I don't think I'm being too glib. You think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm going
to call John Kelly on the break if he wants to call.
One of the most bizarre.
He's a batshit fascist. Okay, I'm just telling you, you do not want this guy. And by the way, when I am in Guantanamo, okay, hopefully you have leaped over Joe Rogan. And you'll be saying, I was on the podcast with Mooch. I was on the live show. He's in Guantanamo, and Trump is a fascist.
One of the most bizarre interviews I did was with my old boss, Tony Blair, for GQ magazine a few years ago. And I said to him, this was a few years ago now, I said, are you not worried about the resonance that exists? This is when Trump was president, between the 30s in Germany and other parts of Europe and what's happening in America now. And he said to me, oh, for God's sake, Alistair, get over this Trump-Hitler thing that you've got. Tony phoned me the day after January 7 and said, you might have a point. Because I think that when you think that the state exists for you, as opposed to that you exist for the state, then I think you are well down that road. I think when you have no respect for the rule of law, when you have no respect for free media, when you have no respect for human rights, you have no respect for the basic citizens.
Huge enemies list. Enemies list.
I think that is fascism.
And we're hoping really that it's just his intense laziness is what prevents him from being a full sort of fascist. Because
there's what our
his attention deficit and his dyslexia.
If he's playing golf, then he's not being a fascist.
All right, good. 60%, 65% yes.
Dominic and I are losing this debate.
Yeah. But I think that's because they're ultimately using a different definition of fascism from the one that I'm using.
But what is not? What's
the Oxford Dictionary? I mean,
so you're using the word
fascist. Don't be the Oxford Dictionary.
You're
look
using
with your
the word
eyes.
fascist to mean
see
somebody...
a fascist, know a fascist. Don't go to the Oxford
but hold on a minute.
Dictionary.
The definition.
But you're using it to mean somebody who is undemocratic, who is narcissistic, who wants
to put my ass in jail over my free speech.
But putting you in jail is not the definition of fascism. I mean, I hate to break it to you,
but it's a symptom of fascism. It's a symptom of fascism.
Okay, listen.
It might be a symptom
you don't need an ideology.
No more makeup for you at the break. I'm just letting you know, I'm cutting you off. Okay, I'm telling.
But there are so many.
Telling Patricia, you're not getting any more makeup.
There are loads of dictatorial, authoritarian regimes, and how were in the 20th century that would have locked you up, that weren't fascist.
He does love the idea of a strong man, though. We can agree on that. Marina,
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, he absolutely loves the idea of a strong man. He recognises them around the world. But I would say that the people around him trouble me almost more because when he's on the golf course, his work as the president, if he becomes the president, what they'll be doing in his name, I think, has a potential to be much more dangerous. We might be saved by his laziness.
I think Musk is a fascist. I think Elon Musk is a fascist.
I think Elon Musk, actually, you're on much safer ground calling him a fascist than you are Trump. Because I think Elon Musk...
Well, in which case, Trump is the leader of a group of people, sovereign individuals, who I define as having really fascistic...
So I think somebody like Musk, or his tech allies, they do believe that the world can be remade.
Get rid of democracy, make it all about wealth.
Human nature, the human condition, can be fundamentally changed, as fascists did in the 1920s.
Is Bannon a fascist?
A wannabe. He's a wannabe. He would help a fascist. He's an agent of a fascist.
Yeah.
He's not capable of the charisma of
fascists are idealists.
Yeah.
They dream of a better tomorrow and a better world.
And people like D'Annunzio behind Mussolini have these sort of strange modernist, high modernist
the modernism is absolutely central to fascism.
Yeah. Good, I enjoyed that debate. I think we won, Marina. I think we won.
I mean, I don't even... it's not even a debate. I mean, we gotta...
That's the thing. I'm completely losing track of time.
2.0.0 Christofascism.
What fools these mortals be.
Christofascism. What is that? Well, you're going to have to wait. I had planned on doing it as a part of this video, but unfortunately this video kind of spiraled out of control, got too long, and I'm going to produce that as a similar video in a sort of similar way to the way that this one is done, but on Christofascism in particular. I genuinely hope that you have taken something valuable away from this video and that you've improved your views politically in some way. If you have, be sure to like the video, leave a comment letting me know if it's helped you in any way. And if you want to support my work and my channel, you can do so by going in the description and finding links to my Patreon and other things where you can support me through PayPal and a one-off donation. And that, there's very low tiers if you just wanted to subscribe on Patreon and donate some small amount of money. It genuinely really helps me, and I appreciate everyone who supports me. This Sunday, I have a patron-only question and answer session that I'm going to be doing, and so obviously if you get access before then, you'll be able to participate in that too.